Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we tumble into smoke, suspicion, and the kind of palace politics that makes even Game of Thrones look like a pleasant brunch. The year is 1553, and England holds its breath as a young king fades fast. Behind castle walls, knives are being sharpened, some literal, some political. Outside, in muddy alleys and quiet chapels, whispers grow louder who will wear the crown next. Before we start, a gentle warning: our subject tonight is not known for her warmth or mercy. In fact, if you're squeamish about things like public executions and spiritual retribution through fire, well, they probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The king is dying. 16-year-old Edward VI, son of Henry VIII, and his short-lived queen Jane Seymour, lies in a haze of fever and coughing fits. His skin is pale, his breath shallow, and the weight of an entire kingdom rests on his narrow chest. He's the first monarch raised Protestant, and he knows his older half-sister Mary, a devout Catholic, is next in line by blood. But blood, he's decided, isn't everything. Mary Tudor, Henry's firstborn, is no stranger to political whiplash. She's seen titles given and stripped, mothers banished, and stepmothers multiply like rabbits in springtime. Still, her claim to the throne is legally solid. She's the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, once Queen of England. But Edward, heavily influenced by his fiercely Protestant advisors, wants none of it. To him, Mary's religion isn't just outdated, it's dangerous. So, in the king's final months, a daring plan unfolds bypass Mary entirely. Instead, the crown will go to Lady Jane Grey, a timid 17-year-old who just so happens to be Protestant and married to one of the most powerful noblemen's sons in the land. It's a slick bit of dynastic leapfrogging, but it reeks of desperation. As Edward breathes his last on July 6th, 1553, the plan kicks into motion. Couriers gallop through muddy fields delivering the news Lady Jane is queen. London buzzes with confusion. Bells ring, but not quite in celebration. Jane, meanwhile, is quietly told she's queen now, between bites of breakfast. Mary, however, is not nibbling toast. She's galloping. From her estate in East Anglia, she races toward her allies, summoning loyalists with every stride. She writes bold letters claiming the throne, invoking both law and divine right. The countryside listens, and then, shockingly, so does London. Support swells behind Mary, and noblemen defect from Jane's side like rats fleeing a ship that was never seaworthy. Even Jane's father-in-law, the powerful Duke of Northumberland, fumbles as the tide turns. Within 9 days, Lady Jane Grey's reign crumbles. She's arrested, stripped of her title, and stashed in the Tower of London, perhaps still wondering how she became a queen in the first place. Mary Tudor enters London in a blaze of triumph. Crowds cheer, bells finally ring for real, and a woman of 37, once thought banished from power forever, ascends the throne as Queen Mary the Worse. But beneath her velvet robes and royal smile, something else smoulders. It's easy to imagine Mary, standing on the threshold of the throne room, thinking of the insults, the betrayals, the long years of humiliation. Her father once declared her illegitimate. Her beloved mother died alone, discarded for a newer model. Her religion was mocked, her voice ignored. Now, finally, the world must listen. Yet this isn't a fairy tale ending, not even close. From the first day of her rule, Mary faces a fractured kingdom. England has flirted with Protestantism for over a decade. Under Henry VIII, monasteries were dissolved, priests replaced, and Latin hymns swapped for English sermons. Under Edward VI, these changes hardened into policy. But for Mary, it all feels like a betrayal of tradition, of God, and of her mother's memory. So she plans a restoration, not just of the throne, but of the faith. Almost immediately, she calls for the Latin Mass to return. Bishops imprisoned under Edward are freed. Leading Protestant voices are silenced or exiled. The message is clear: the old ways are back, and those who resist, well, they're on notice. Still, it's not all fire and brimstone, yet. In the early days, Mary shows surprising restraint. She grants clemency to Jane Grey, whose only real crime was having a powerful family. Even Thomas Cranmer, the archbishop who annulled her mother's marriage and championed the Protestant cause, is initially spared. Historians still argue whether this leniency came from political savvy or personal hesitation. But the grace period doesn't last long. Mary has bigger plans and bigger problems, chief among them her heir. She has none. At 37, childless and recently enthroned, she knows time is short. A secure Catholic succession means she needs a husband, and fast. Enter Philip of Spain. Their engagement is wildly unpopular. The English, fiercely independent and still salty about foreign influence, balk at the idea of a Spanish king. Parliament resists, Londoners riot, murmurs of rebellion swirl like smoke, but Mary digs in, the marriage proceeds. As she walks down the aisle to meet her groom, a man she's never actually met in person, many wonder, is this a queen making a strategic alliance? Or a lonely woman clinging to a last chance at love? Spoiler, it's mostly strategy. Philip, awkward and reserved, is less Prince Charming and more diplomatic checklist. Their union is politically potent but personally cold, and most inconveniently it fails to produce a child. Still, the wedding marks a turning point. With her Spanish alliance secured, Mary's tone shifts. The soft gloves come off. Soon after, legislation rolls through Parliament repealing Protestant reforms. The heresy laws, dormant for years, are revived. And with that, the fire truly begins. In the town squares of England, stakes are hammered into cobblestones. Kindling is stacked, names are read aloud, and under Mary's orders, the executions begin. The first to burn is John Rogers, a scholar and preacher. He's marched through the streets in 1555, tied to the post, and offered one last chance to recant. He refuses. Flames rise. His screams echo. Children reportedly watch their fathers die. And Mary, she watches too. Figuratively, if not always literally. These executions aren't mere punishment. They're theatre. They're warnings. They're declarations. This is what happens when you defy the Queen and the Church. She believes it's for their souls. She believes, perhaps terrifyingly, that she's saving them. And it's only the beginning. Behind palace doors, Mary surrounds herself with like-minded clergy, none more infamous than Bishop Edmund Bonner. Bonner, once dismissed by Protestants as the Pope's bloodhound, becomes her chief enforcer. His court churns out death sentences with chilling efficiency. And while Mary rarely attends these executions, she knows about everyone. The numbers begin to climb. Over the next few years, nearly 300 people, men, women, and even teenagers, are burned alive for heresy. It's a rate of execution England has never seen before, and, to this day, hasn't seen since. And still, the Queen prays. She fasts. She lights candles for the souls of the condemned. To Mary, this isn't tyranny, it's redemption. But public sentiment begins to shift. Smoke carries more than scent. It carries stories. Of elderly priests forced to recant. Of mothers separated from their children. Of young students singing hymns as flames consume them. These tales spread, whispered in taverns, scratched into letters, printed abroad. Mary believes she's purifying her realm, but many in that realm are starting to believe she's just lighting it on fire. She kneels alone in her private chapel, face lit only by the flicker of a solitary candle. The palace beyond the heavy wooden door sleeps uneasily, but Queen Mary prays with the steadiness of someone convinced of her own divine mission. She clasps the rosary tighter. The smell of ash still lingers in the corridors. Subtle, yes, but never absent. Mary Tudor has waited a lifetime to be queen, and now that she wears the crown, she has no intention of ruling passively. To her, this isn't merely about power, it's about salvation. Her people, her country, her very soul, all depend on restoring the true faith. Every burned heretic, she believes, is a soul reclaimed from the abyss, and each death is a necessary offering. But to understand this fire-forged monarch, we have to rewind to where her fury was born her childhood. Mary is born in 1516, the only surviving child of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. She is, for a time, the apple of her father's eye. Precocious, intelligent, and musically gifted, she dazzles the court with her fluency in Latin and her early grasp of statecraft. Ambassadors call her a jewel of Christendom. She's betrothed to powerful princes while still in the nursery. But her golden childhood begins to corrode the moment her father meets Anne Boleyn. Henry's obsession with a male heir becomes pathological. Catherine, after multiple pregnancies and miscarriages, is unable to provide one. So Henry seeks a solution, not in medicine, but in matrimony. He decides to annul his marriage, claiming it was invalid from the start because Catherine was once married to his brother. The Pope, however, refuses. Thus begins England's break from Rome, a schism that rewires the entire nation and fractures Mary's life. Suddenly Mary is declared illegitimate. Her mother is banished. Her household is dissolved. She's forbidden from seeing Catherine. Her title of princess is stripped. She becomes simply Lady Mary. Servants are ordered not to bow to her. Her rooms are downsized. And when she refuses to acknowledge Anne Boleyn as queen, she is exiled entirely from court. Historians still argue whether this period was the crucible of Mary's later rigidity. Did years of humiliation and spiritual abandonment forge her iron Catholicism, or was it always there, inherited from her devout Spanish mother? Either way, it leaves scars. She lives for years under house arrest, essentially a royal prisoner in her own homeland. During this time, Mary falls ill repeatedly, both in body and, as some speculate, in spirit. There are records of her collapsing, of bloodied noses and violent stomach pains. Stress, perhaps, or just another bodily rebellion against the cold indifference of her father's court. And when her mother dies in 1536, alone and unacknowledged, Mary isn't allowed to attend the funeral. Then comes Anne Boleyn's downfall, an ironic twist if ever there was one. Accused of adultery, treason and incest, Anne is executed by sword while Mary, somewhere distant, listens to the bells toll and wonders what kind of justice this is. Still, her fortunes don't exactly improve. Henry continues his wife-collecting spree with Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and finally Catherine Parr. Each new stepmother must decide what to do with this inconvenient daughter of the invalid marriage. Some show kindness, others indifference, but Mary never regains her full status. When Henry finally dies in 1547, he leaves behind a 10-year-old son, Edward, as king. Mary is technically restored in the line of succession, but she knows better than to breathe easy. The Protestant advisers who surround Edward view Mary as an outdated relic, a dangerous relic. They begin quietly pressuring her to attend Protestant services, abandon the Catholic Mass, and keep her nose out of politics. She refuses, firmly, repeatedly, even when threatened with arrest. Her stubbornness becomes legendary. She celebrates Mass in private. She writes letters to the Holy Roman Emperor, her cousin Charles V, begging for protection. She turns down marriage offers, builds quiet alliances, and watches the throne from the shadows. And all the while, the heretics, at least in her view, grow bolder. Edward's court moves swiftly. Latin is banned from services. Clerical celibacy is abolished. Church wealth is seized. Priests are punished for holding the host aloft too long. Statues of saints are pulled down. Churches whitewashed. Altars stripped bare. Mary sees it all as sacrilege. To her, the English Reformation isn't a progression. It's a betrayal, a cosmic offence. And she swears silently to one day reverse it. That chance comes when Edward's health fails. In a twist only Tudor England could deliver, Edward and his advisers attempt a political magic trick, skipping over Mary and Elizabeth entirely in favour of Lady Jane Grey. Poor Jane. She's more pawn than plotter, a teenager with good Latin and bad luck. Married off to Guildford Dudley, son of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, she's suddenly declared queen by a coterie of desperate men. For 9 shaky days she wears the crown, bewildered, isolated, and completely unprepared. Mary, meanwhile, moves like lightning. She gathers supporters, rides across the country in a blaze of banners and prayers, and wins the throne almost without a drop of blood. London flips sides. The army defect. Even nobles who once mocked her bow deeply now. Jane is captured, imprisoned in the Tower, and Mary enters London victorious, riding a white horse beneath arches of flowers. But it's not just a personal triumph, it's theological. She takes the crown with a quiet promise to restore the true faith, to make England Catholic again, and to burn away every trace of rebellion with sacred fire. Still, even in power, Mary hesitates. At first, she rules gently. Many of her enemies are forgiven. Jane Grey is spared. For a while. Parliament is cautious, but not yet obstructive. Even some Protestants hoped she might allow private tolerance. But then she announces her intention to marry Philip of Spain. This changes everything. Philip is Catholic, foreign, and the embodiment of every English fear about being absorbed into continental politics. Rebellion brews. Sir Thomas Wyatt leads an armed uprising, hoping to stop the wedding and place Elizabeth, Mary's Protestant half-sister, on the throne instead. The rebellion fails. Wyatt is captured, executed, and suddenly leniency dries up. Jane Grey, innocent or not, becomes a liability. She and her young husband are led to the block. Mary watches from behind palace walls as Jane, still a teenager, dies with quiet dignity. Her executioner botches the first strike. The message is brutal, Mary will not be challenged, and so begins the bonfires. The first burnings are symbolic. Leading Protestant preachers, those who served under Edward, are tried for heresy. John Rogers, Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley. Their names echo still in history's ears. They are offered clemency in exchange for recanting. All refuse. Their deaths are choreographed for maximum effect. Burned in public squares, flames licking at their robes, crowds gathered to watch, to scream, to pray. Some cheer, others weep. A woman watching Latimer and Ridley burn records the moment Latimer shouts, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man." We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out. Dramatic, absolutely. But it works. The martyrs' stories spread like wildfire, poetic, tragic, infuriating. While Mary sees salvation, many see senseless cruelty. Still, the executions continue. Mary doesn't flinch. Her council, while increasingly uneasy, carries out her commands. Bonner's court runs like a grim factory, processing suspects, issuing condemnations. Names are recorded in neat ink. Fires are stoked. People are burned for owning English Bibles, for attending secret Protestant services, for refusing to attend Mass. Even a woman named Agnes Potton is executed for simply housing a dissident preacher. These are not just political threats. They are neighbours, mothers, children, and Mary. She prays harder. By 1556, over 100 people have died by flame. More are imprisoned. London smells of smoke and scorched linen. Abroad, Mary's reputation blackens. Letters from ambassadors describe her with unease. Whispers of Bloody Mary begin, not just in taverns, but in foreign courts. Yet within her inner circle, Mary insists the burnings are acts of love. A scholar later writes that she saw herself not as a tyrant, but as a physician, cutting away rot to save the body. But the rot she sees is everywhere, and growing. Her marriage brings no heir. She grows ill, pale, bloated. Her first pregnancy ends with nothing more than swelling and false labour. Scholars still debate whether it was a tumour, a hysterical pregnancy, or just wishful thinking wrapped in layers of royal protocol. The court tiptoes around the subject, but one thing is clear without a child: Mary's legacy may end in smoke. And still, the fires continue. Winter has settled over London, but the city doesn't feel cold, not with so many fires crackling at street corners. Smoke drifts like a second fog, curling between chimney pots and winding through alleys. The warmth it brings is deceptive. At its core, it's not hearth fire, but judgment. In February 1555, Thomas Cranmer, once the Archbishop of Canterbury, once the man who helped Henry VIII break from Rome, is led from his cell. The crowds jeer, though not all of them know why. He wears the robes of a condemned man, and his face is pale, haunted. This moment has been long in the making. Mary has waited years for this. It was Cranmer who validated her mother's divorce, Cranmer who crowned Anne Boleyn, Cranmer who wrote the Book of Common Prayer, now outlawed, and who became the very face of English Protestantism. To Mary, his death is not just justice, it's personal. But first, a twist. Cranmer recants. Under pressure, perhaps even torture, he signs a series of documents acknowledging the Pope's authority and denouncing his own teachings. He is promised mercy. He is told he'll live. Mary, however, changes her mind. On March 21st, 1556, he's dragged to St. Mary's Church in Oxford. Forced to deliver a final recantation, he shocks everyone by turning the speech on its head. In a quiet voice, trembling but clear, he publicly denounces his recantations, calls the Pope Antichrist, declares his faith in Christ alone. Then, famously, he says he will punish the hand that signed the lies. As he is tied to the stake, he thrusts that very hand into the flames first, letting it burn while the rest of his body is still intact. It is a moment of theatrical defiance, a martyr's punctuation mark. Even Mary's supporters squirm. The people watching begin to shift uncomfortably. This is no longer a faceless rebel. This is an old man, a scholar, a man who begged forgiveness and was granted none. His fingers curl as they blacken. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman covers her child's eyes. But it's too late. The image is burned into memory. That same month, Bishop Hugh Latimer and Bishop Nicholas Ridley are executed in the same square. Latimer's final shout to Ridley about lighting a candle in England is still echoing in public consciousness, but Cranmer's burning ignites something else entirely doubt. Mary, however, remains resolute. She's not swayed by tears or by shouts. She continues to insist that the kingdom's soul hangs in the balance, and in that battle, hesitation is sin. Yet even as she tightens her grip, something begins to unravel. Inside her court, cracks spread like ice. Philip, her Spanish husband, has left for the continent. Their marriage, cold from the start, is now almost non-existent. He writes formal letters, signs them with distant affection, and engages in wars Mary cannot afford. Even more unsettling, he does not return when she claims to be pregnant again. This second pregnancy, like the first, ends in disappointment. But this time, it's harder to disguise. Her belly does not swell convincingly. The palace physicians whisper behind thick doors. Courtiers avert their eyes, and Mary herself begins to feel a familiar panic creeping in. She had promised the people an heir, a Catholic heir. She had promised that the Marian dynasty would endure, but now, with no child and failing health, her reign feels increasingly impermanent. And yet, the burnings continue. In the village of Lewes, 10 Protestants, men and women, are chained together and burned in a single mass execution. In Gloucester, a woman named Joan Waste, blind since birth, is hanged and then burned for refusing to attend Catholic Mass. She reportedly recites scripture by heart before the flames consume her. Stories like these begin to pile up, not just in church records, but in ballads, in pamphlets, in whispered stories passed between mothers and daughters. Mary's name becomes attached not to piety, but to cruelty. Bloody Mary is still not her common nickname, but the ingredients are there, steeping like strong tea, and then, as if the crown itself is cursed, England is struck by natural calamity. The harvest of 1556 fails, rain pours relentlessly, crops rot in the fields, bread becomes scarce, prices soar, people begin to starve. And as famine tightens its grip, an outbreak of sweating sickness, one of Tudor England's most feared plagues, follows. The people begin to murmur, God is not pleased, not with Mary, not with this queen who lights fires while bellies growl. Historians still argue whether these disasters were merely unlucky timing or divine coincidence. But to the public, already spooked by religious instability and dynastic uncertainty, they feel like omens. And there's one more problem looming on the horizon, one with clever eyes and red gold hair. Elizabeth. Mary's half-sister has kept her head low through the storm, but her Protestant sympathies are well known. She writes carefully worded letters. She smiles when appropriate. She attends Mass, albeit stiffly. But everyone understands that Elizabeth is the Protestant hope. Mary understands this too. For a time, Elizabeth is imprisoned, then released, then placed under house arrest. The Queen tries everything short of execution to neutralise her rival. But unlike Jane Grey, Elizabeth is popular, politically connected, and tactically brilliant. More than once, Mary considers signing the warrant for Elizabeth's death. But she doesn't. Perhaps she remembers their shared childhood, the brief years before everything shattered. Or perhaps she fears the backlash. After all, Elizabeth is next in line. If Mary dies childless, the throne passes to her. It's a cruel irony. Mary burns Protestants by the dozens, and yet if she fails to bear a child, a Protestant will still inherit the crown. She doubles down. In 1557, more executions take place. Whole families are torn apart. In Canterbury, a woman gives birth in prison days before she's burned. Her infant is handed to strangers. At this point, the number of burnings surpasses 250. Bonner, Mary's brutal enforcer, becomes infamous. He personally oversees trials, scolds weeping mothers, and mocks recantations. A nickname forms in the crowd, Bloody Bonner. He is the monster in this particular closet. Yet Mary never condemns him. She only prays harder. In the royal apartments, she grows weaker. Her stomach cramps, her skin dulls, her teeth hurt, her legs swell. Rumours swirl cancer, kidney failure, depression. No one knows for sure. And then, a military humiliation. In 1558, Calais, England's last stronghold on the continent, is lost to the French. It is a brutal blow. For over 2 centuries, Calais had been the jewel of England's foreign holdings, a reminder of past glory. Mary receives the news quietly, then reportedly whispers, "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." She weeps, and not just for Calais. That same year, her health worsens dramatically. She can no longer walk without assistance. She drifts in and out of sleep. Physicians attend her bedside constantly, but no treatment works. Philip, far away, sends a cool letter of sympathy, but no ships to return home. By the autumn of 1558, the end is near. She names Elizabeth as her successor, perhaps grudgingly, perhaps with a final prayer that Elizabeth will somehow return to the church. But Mary knows better. She has seen the smirk behind her sister's courtesy. As the fever tightens its grip, Mary loses her appetite. Her last days are quiet. Confessors visit often. She receives last rites in the old Latin form. Outside, the bells toll slowly. On November 17th, 1558, Queen Mary I of England dies. No child, no husband by her side, no cheering crowds. London exhales. The burnings stop, the fires die out, the church service changes. Again. But her legacy smoulders. Mary Tudor reigned just 5 years. But in that time she changed England more by what she tried to undo than by what she built. Her restoration of Catholicism, so passionately pursued, is rolled back almost immediately under Elizabeth. Her marriage alliance with Spain crumbles. Her name becomes shorthand for fanaticism. And yet, was she evil? That's the question that haunts the corners of every historian's page. Mary did not invent religious persecution. Her father, Henry VIII, executed monks and martyrs. Her successors would imprison, exile, and kill in their own ways. But the method, burning, was hers. The volume, nearly 300 deaths, was hers. And the conviction that she alone could save England's soul, entirely hers. To her it was mercy. To her victims it was madness. To history, it's still unsettled. England wakes to a new queen and a cold sun. November 1558 feels different in the bones. Heavier somehow, like the country is shaking off a long fever. Mary I is dead. The bells toll for her, but not as they once did. There is no carnival, no flowers strewn in the streets, just a quiet shift, like a stage curtain slowly falling and another rising behind it. Elizabeth Tudor steps forward. She arrives at court with measured grace, her face composed, her voice soft, and her words laced with practiced humility. But everyone watching knows this is a new chapter, and the pages are not going to smoulder. Not anymore. Still, Mary's shadow doesn't fade easily. Those years of fire leave marks deeper than stone. In small villages, the ash from her bonfires has long since scattered, but the stories linger. The smith who once built the stakes remembers the crackling. The mothers who clutched their children tighter every time a bell rang still hear it in their dreams. The Protestants, those who survived, return from exile cautiously, like deer stepping onto an unfamiliar path. Yet even as the smoke clears, the question hangs in the air like a ghost: why did Mary burn so many? To understand that, we have to trace not just her personal history, but the spiritual engine driving her reign. Mary was, to her marrow, a medieval Catholic. She saw the world not in shades of diplomacy, but in salvation or damnation. Heaven was real. Hell was certain. And heresy wasn't merely a wrong opinion, it was a contagion. One that, if left unchecked, could damn an entire nation. And she'd seen contagion before. Her father's divorce from her mother wasn't just political betrayal, it was spiritual dislocation. The entire Church of England, born from that moment, was a wound in her eyes, a festering one she intended to cauterize with fire. But it wasn't just Mary's theology pushing the flames. It was her sense of betrayal. Remember, this is a woman who'd been a princess and a pariah, sometimes in the same week. She had watched her mother, the pious and regal Catherine of Aragon, reduced to a lonely exile. She had been bullied, isolated, and forced to deny her own legitimacy. She had knelt beside beds praying for her father's soul, even while he stripped her of title and security. The fire she unleashed as queen wasn't only aimed at Protestants, it was aimed at ghosts, at old wounds, at a father she could never forgive, and a church that mocked everything she held sacred. This internal war played out in the external world, and it's no surprise that, once Mary had power, she wielded it like a hammer. But the burnings were also systemic, not just the Queen's whims, but a legally sanctioned campaign. After restoring England's ties with Rome, Mary and her parliament reintroduced the heresy laws from an earlier, harsher time. These laws gave the government authority to arrest and execute anyone who refused Catholic doctrine. No trial by jury, no leniency for quiet dissent. You either attended Mass and submitted, or you burned. And they did burn. Sometimes in town squares, other times on riverbanks or churchyards. Often at dawn, when the streets were quiet and the morning mist still hugged the ground. Officials would drag the condemned to the stake, tie them with ropes and chains, then pile wood and straw at their feet. A priest might offer one last chance to recant. A few did. Most didn't. There was protocol to the fire. Too much wood, and the person suffocated before flames reached them. Too little, and the death dragged on for hours. The right balance ensured maximum pain, but not too much dignity. And always there were crowds. Some came for spectacle, others for protest. Children sometimes climbed trees for better views. Merchants sold bread and sweetmeats near the executions, turning tragedy into street theatre. The smell of charred flesh, many said, lingered for days. Through it all, Mary remained mostly unseen, cloistered in her palace, surrounded by priests, incense, and confession. But she knew. She approved. The bishops reported to her. And Bonner, her bull-headed, brutal enforcer, became infamous as her hand. Still, not everyone around her supported the terror. Privy councillors grew uneasy. Parliament grew restless. Even Philip, her husband, quietly advised against further executions when he realised how it was turning public opinion. Foreign ambassadors wrote letters filled with cautious phrasing and worried metaphors. The Pope himself, Paul IV, once praised Mary but later expressed concern over the extremity of the purge. But Mary was unmoved. Her reign was not meant to be popular, it was meant to be righteous. And in her righteousness, she burned not only the poor and the vocal, but the elite. Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury and last surviving Plantagenet, was beheaded in Mary's early days, not for heresy, but for her potential claim to the throne. She had been executed under Henry VIII, but her memory was quietly honoured during Mary's reign. Still, others weren't so lucky. Nobles who had dabbled in Protestant politics were closely watched. Some lost lands, others lost freedom. A lesser-known case was that of Richard Woodman, a former ironmaster from Sussex. Accused of heresy, he spent nearly 2 years in prison before being burned with 9 others. His trial records, preserved in painstaking detail, show a man who debated theology with wit and precision, even as he faced death. He refused to recant, saying, "I am not afraid to die, but I would not burn for ignorance." That was the chilling part for many the intelligence of the condemned. These weren't just wild-eyed zealots or frothing radicals. Many were educated, articulate, even serene in the face of death. It gave their martyrdom weight. It made the crown look cruel. And then there were the women. Protestantism had allowed a degree of religious autonomy for women, reading scripture in English, leading private prayers, even writing treatises. Under Mary, these liberties vanished. Women like Anne Askew were dragged into cells, interrogated, and eventually burned. Askew, famously tortured on the rack, had her limbs so mangled she had to be carried to the stake in a chair. Mary didn't blink. Her own gender didn't spare her from enacting violence upon others of her sex. If anything, she saw herself as a mother disciplining a nation gone astray, and mothers, in the Tudor sense, didn't hesitate when obedience was at stake. Still, the contradiction lingered. Mary was capable of deep compassion. Her letters to her mother, Catherine, were tender and longing. She cared for her servants, rewarded loyalty, and kept a close circle of female attendants whom she trusted completely. She fasted regularly, gave alms to the poor, and personally oversaw the rebuilding of churches destroyed during her father's reign. She even restored Princess Elizabeth to the line of succession, eventually, despite knowing that her sister would undo everything she'd built. Why, then, the disconnect? How could this queen, so devoted in faith and personal virtue, commit to such wide-scale terror? Historians still wrestle with this. Some argue that Mary genuinely believed the fires were acts of love, that the pain was temporal, the salvation eternal. Others suggest she was manipulated by hardliners in her council, especially Bonner and Gardiner. Still others believe Mary, consumed by her own traumas, simply projected her grief onto a world that had betrayed her. A fringe theory claims her phantom pregnancies were more than psychosomatic, that tumours or cysts clouded her reasoning and compounded her zeal. But there's little evidence for this beyond speculation. More likely, Mary was what many rulers of her time were shaped by theology, trauma, and the brutal logic of royal power. In the end, it was not fire that brought her down, but failure. Failure to produce an heir, failure to hold Calais, failure to convince her people that Catholicism meant comfort instead of fear. The fires didn't purify England, they frightened it. And so, when Elizabeth takes the throne, the contrast is immediate. The bonfires vanish, English is restored to the churches, the Book of Common Prayer returns. Bishops who once feared for their lives breathe easier. And Mary's legacy is quietly pushed to the margins, but not forgotten. In whispers, ballads, and eventually in Protestant propaganda, the name Bloody Mary emerges, not immediately but insidiously. Fox's Book of Martyrs, published during Elizabeth's reign, cements her image as a tyrant, a butcher, a monster in a velvet dress. The nuance vanishes, the tragedy remains. Mary Tudor, the girl who once danced in the royal nursery, who wept for her mother, who read Latin by candlelight, becomes a figure in folklore, a mirror ghost, a warning. But she was real, and for 5 years England burned with her. The streets of London returned to something like normal, though normal is always a moving target in Tudor England. The smoke has cleared, the pyres are cold, but the memory of fire still glows just behind the eyes of anyone old enough to remember. Children who once pressed their faces to windows to glimpse the flames now step carefully through markets, tugged close by mothers who whisper warnings about obedience and silence. The realm is quiet, not because peace has returned, but because it is stunned, like a crowd after a storm has passed, unsure if it's truly over. Yet even in this lull, stories ripple outward. In Protestant circles, the burnings become scripture in their own right. The names of the martyrs, Ridley, Latimer, Cranmer, are spoken in reverent tones. In quiet corners of churches, surviving Bibles are pressed into hands with trembling fingers. Families huddle in barns, cellars and back rooms, reading verses aloud in hushed defiance. These gatherings are no longer just religious, they are acts of resistance. Mary had tried to crush the Reformation with fire, but in doing so she gave it martyrs, she gave it saints. It's an uncomfortable truth for those who hope to forget. And for Queen Elizabeth, now several months into her reign, it's a strategic reality. Her older sister's scorched earth campaign hasn't just left bodies, it's left scars. If Mary had envisioned a nation of obedient Catholics rising from the ashes, she miscalculated. The fires didn't forge unity. They lit the fuse for a different kind of explosion. Elizabeth, famously pragmatic, understands this. She attends Mass during Mary's final months, but her eyes never quite match the prayer book in her lap. Once crowned, she swiftly re-establishes the Protestant Church of England, but with a shrewd balance. The services are in English again, the Book of Common Prayer is restored, but crucifixes remain in some chapels, Latin hymns aren't entirely banned, bishops who survived the Marian Purge are invited back to court, their reputations miraculously rehabilitated. This isn't just religious policy, it's damage control. Elizabeth understands that the country is still singed. She doesn't want to flip the pendulum too hard. A bloodless reformation is her goal, or at least one with less public flame. She commissions new sermons, new prayers, and new narratives. And central to these is a story the rise from Mary's ashes. It's here that the mythology of Bloody Mary begins to calcify. During Mary's reign, that nickname doesn't exist, not publicly. People speak of the Queen, of her grace, or, in fearful whispers, the Catholic. But under Elizabeth, Protestant historians like John Foxe publish vivid, heart-wrenching accounts of those burned under Mary's orders. Foxe's Book of Martyrs becomes a bestseller, printed and reprinted, passed from hand to hand. Its pages drip with horror. Children watching their parents die, elderly preachers enduring the flames with saintly calm, women clutching rosaries as their skin peels away. Foxe doesn't merely document history, he shapes it. He paints Mary as a religious tyrant, a cruel fanatic, a queen who drank blood as wine. And while the truth is more complex, the image sticks. Bloody Mary. But let's pause here. Let's remember, Mary wasn't the first English monarch to burn people. Henry VIII, her own father, executed both Protestants and Catholics who failed to toe his personal theological line. He had monks hanged, drawn, and quartered. He had heretics roasted. He even burned a few women, including Anabaptists, for challenging royal supremacy, and Elizabeth. Despite her more polished image, she eventually orders executions too. Dozens of Catholic priests accused of treason are hanged and disemboweled under her reign. Religious violence, it turns out, isn't exclusive to Mary. So why her? Why does she bear the brand of Bloody Mary? Perhaps it's the fire. Burning, unlike hanging or beheading, feels intimate, prolonged, visceral. The crackling of flesh, the screams that last for minutes instead of seconds. There's something about flame that makes cruelty more memorable. Or perhaps it's because Mary was a woman. A queen ruling alone was still an anomaly. Mary's gender was a constant undercurrent in the criticisms of her reign. Her marriage to Philip of Spain sparked fears that she'd be ruled by a foreigner. Her inability to produce a child became not just a dynastic failure, but a personal one, whispered about in chamber halls and markets. When she turned to religion, her devotion was called obsession. When she ordered executions, her piety became savagery. Would a man have received the same legacy? Historians still debate it. But while the scholars argue, the stories endure. In small country parishes, ministers retell the tale of the Marian martyrs every All Saints' Day. Parents name their children Elizabeth, not Mary. And in dim-lit taverns, drinkers chant to mirrors, Bloody Mary, half in jest, half in fear. That part, the ghost story part, comes much later, but its roots stretch back here, into the bloody soil of 1550s England. Meanwhile, back in the 16th century, those who lived through Mary's reign try to move on. Some succeed, others don't. There's John Foxe, who returns from exile to compile his monumental work. He dedicates it to Elizabeth, framing it not just as history, but as divine proof that Protestantism survived the flames. His book includes woodcuts, dramatic engravings of martyrs chained to stakes, flames rising around their feet, eyes lifted to heaven. These images etch themselves into the national psyche. Then there's Edmund Bonner, the infamous Bishop of London. Under Elizabeth, he's imprisoned in the Marshalsea, where he dies in 1569. The crowds that once cowered at his name barely flinch at his death. His legacy is so stained that his burial is quiet, unattended by all but the most loyal of clerics. Others fade into obscurity. The executioners, the jailers, the informants, all the little cogs in Mary's machine slowly slip into the mist of history. But their work lingers. In every sermon, in every whispered warning, in every Protestant prayer thanking God for deliverance, their actions echo. And Mary She lies buried in Westminster Abbey, alongside her half-sister Elizabeth. Yes, together, in the same tomb. The Latin inscription doesn't favour one over the other. It simply reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here rest two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of the resurrection." But the irony is sharp. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, who undid nearly everything Mary built, now rests beside her. Their bones mingled in death, even as their legacies wore across centuries. The tomb itself becomes a kind of metaphor. Stone smooths over conflict. Time blends contradiction. Visitors pass by, snapping photos, reading the plaque, moving on. But history, real history, is messier. It burns slower. And sometimes it never cools. Even today, Mary remains a riddle. Was she a pious reformer or a religious terrorist? A wounded daughter seeking justice, or a fanatic consumed by fire? Was she driven by faith, by vengeance, or by something deeper, something no historian can quite reach? We'll never know for sure, because history isn't just dates and names, it's perception. And Mary's perception, unfortunately for her, was scorched into memory by flame. Yet there are those who try to reframe her. Modern historians revisit her reign with more nuance. They acknowledge the brutality but also the intention. They point to her efforts at religious unity, her charity toward the poor, her restoration of coinage and law. They argue that she was not cruel for cruelty's sake, but for salvation's. Still, the fires are hard to forget. And so, her reign lives in contradiction a queen who meant to save her country, remembered for setting it alight. As the Elizabethan sun rises brighter and stronger, Mary becomes the shadow behind it, the cautionary tale, the ghost in the mirror. Not because she failed to rule, but because she ruled by flame. Outside Hampton Court, the rose bushes bloom again, undisturbed by the memories swirling inside those heavy brick walls. Courtiers walk a little taller, ministers speak a little louder. Elizabeth reigns now, and with her comes a new narrative, one sculpted from both aspiration and erasure. But while the speeches praise progress and sermons herald salvation from tyranny, there's one truth no one says aloud. Mary's ghost lingers. Not in a haunting way, exactly, but like the taste of smoke that never fully leaves a room. The fires may have gone out, but their warmth, chilling paradoxically, still radiates in the collective memory of a nation. As the 1560s settle into place, England gradually realigns itself with Protestantism, not through fire, not through public spectacle, but through calculated statecraft and cultural repositioning. And at the centre of this restoration, this Phoenix Act, is the conscious decision to distance the crown from Mary Thurn's methods. Her burnings aren't just viewed as mistakes, they're paraded as evidence of Catholic cruelty. They become the rhetorical drumbeat of Protestant righteousness. But not everyone joins the chant with equal gusto. In pockets across England, especially in the north and the west, where the Catholic faith remains stubbornly rooted, Mary is remembered differently. Her image hangs in secluded convents. Her Latin prayer books are thumbed with reverence. She's spoken of as a martyr queen, a woman abandoned by her husband, betrayed by her country, and ultimately broken not by flame, but by loneliness. In these whispers, she is not Bloody Mary. She is Santa Maria, a saint wronged by history. Meanwhile, across the sea, Catholic Europe watches England with both sorrow and scorn. Spain, still bitter over Philip's political failure to hold sway in Mary's court, grumbles in sermons and diplomatic letters. Rome grieves the loss of a precious English ally, one who tried and failed to return a wayward daughter to the fold. Yet the Vatican remembers Mary fondly. She is not canonised, but she is praised. Her attempts at reform are studied in hushed ecclesiastical circles. Her portraits, dressed in black velvet and golden crucifixes, hang beside those of Spanish queens and Habsburg aunts. But in England, Mary's legacy twists into something else entirely, a cautionary emblem. By the late 16th century, children grow up hearing stories of heretics turned to coal and preachers who sang through flame. These tales are repeated in pulpits, printed in tracts, and carved into Protestant identity. The very idea of Mary becomes shorthand, not for justice, nor rule, nor power, but for extremism, for fire. It's worth pausing on just how quickly this transformation happens. When Mary died in 1558, many still mourned her. Her funeral was elaborate. Bishops wept. Peers offered solemn tributes. And yet, by the time Elizabeth's reign is fully underway, public perception has shifted so completely that Mary seems almost monstrous. That shift wasn't accidental. Elizabeth's advisors, notably William Cecil and later Francis Walsingham, understood the power of narrative. They weren't content to let Mary fade into quiet memory. Instead, they emphasised her persecution of Protestants at every turn. Her reign was framed as a divine warning. Her methods, an object lesson in what not to do. Propaganda flowed like ink. Pamphlets described the smoke curling from Smithfield as if it still hung in the air. Ballads wept over burned pastors and righteous children, and Fox's Book of Martyrs, that ever-growing anthology of Protestant suffering, was strategically placed in churches for public reading. The stories were horrifying, yes, but also oddly inspiring. They framed England not as a victim of tyranny, but as a phoenix risen from it. And in that story, Mary was no longer queen, she was the villain. Still, human memory is a slippery thing. Despite the harshness of her legacy, Mary's reign wasn't a total catastrophe. In fact, some aspects of her rule were surprisingly progressive, though few dared admit it at the time. She reformed the currency, helping to stabilise an economy rocked by debasement under her father. She strengthened the navy. She invested in poor relief, understanding, perhaps more than any of her predecessors, that faith without charity rang hollow. She also laid the groundwork for administrative reforms Elizabeth would later complete, and her insistence on female authority, however contentious, helped normalise the idea of a woman on the throne. But none of that matters in the mirror, because Mary's image, her popular image, has already been crystallised. And it wasn't made of marble or memory, it was made of blood and fire and fear. And mirrors, interestingly, are where her legacy takes its strangest turn. Centuries later, in dusty folklore and children's games, Mary's name is invoked in a way no other monarch's ever has been, not with prayers, not with poems, but with dares, with dim lights, 3 whispers, and a flicker of fear. Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary. The legend claims she'll appear in the mirror, eyes hollow, dress soaked in blood, hands outstretched. Of course, this isn't history, it's myth. The ghost in the mirror has little in common with the real Mary Tudor, but isn't that the final cruelty that her complicated life, full of sorrow and fervour and desperate hope, has been flattened into a schoolyard chant? How did we get from a queen to a curse? Part of it, no doubt, is phonetic. Bloody Mary rolls off the tongue with eerie rhythm. It fits in the mouth like a dare. But it's also a reflection, no pun intended, of how completely Mary's public persona was demonised. Over time, the figure in the mirror ceased to be the historical queen, and instead became a symbol of vengeance, of regret, of things coming back from the dead. And Mary's real story, the one with ink-stained Bibles and phantom pregnancies and desperate prayers by candlelight, vanished beneath the myth. Even scholars can't always resist the pull of that shadow. It's easier, after all, to study a villain than a tragedy. And Mary is both. She is the queen who lost Calais, the queen who never bore a child, the queen who prayed as the people screamed, the queen who died believing she had saved souls, while her realm quietly vowed never to follow her path again. But she was also a girl who loved her mother, a woman who dreamed of peace, a monarch who believed too deeply in a world too cruel to let her keep believing. Even in her final days, Mary held fast to that belief. She never renounced the burnings, never doubted her mission. She died convinced that her soul was safe and that England's might still be salvaged through her sacrifices. Elizabeth would go on to rule for decades, her reign dubbed a golden age. Plays would be written, ships launched, the Spanish Armada crushed. But Mary's 5 years, brief, brutal and burning, would cast the longer shadow. Perhaps that's the final irony. In trying to stamp out Protestantism, Mary gave it its martyrs. In trying to purify the nation, she scorched its memory. In trying to save England's soul, she damned her own name. And all of it, every prayer, every execution, every law passed and child promised, was in service of one terrible hope that faith could be restored through force. She wasn't the only monarch to think that. She certainly wouldn't be the last, but she was the one who lit the match. By the time Mary's bones are cold in Westminster Abbey, the rituals she fought to restore are already beginning to vanish. Latin masses turn back into English services. The old vestments are packed away. Crucifixes quietly disappear from the walls of churches, and plain wooden crosses take their place. The candles on altars dwindle to a symbolic few. England is slipping from Mary's grasp, even in death. And for those who still remember her reign, whether with reverence or revulsion, it becomes a kind of taboo topic. Speaking too fondly of the late Queen can be dangerous. The winds of religious politics shift quickly, and under Elizabeth's watchful counsel, no one wants to be caught gazing too long into yesterday's fire. Yet behind closed doors, the stories continue. In small Catholic enclaves, quiet households along the Yorkshire moors, convents tucked into French borders, and Jesuit circles abroad, Mary is remembered as a kind of martyr queen. not canonised, certainly not universally admired, but mourned all the same. Her failures, they argue, were born not of malice, but of desperation. Her cruelty was not aimless, but sacrificial. She gave her body, her heart, and finally her name to a cause she believed holy. But history, ever merciless, prefers cleaner stories, and Mary's was anything but clean. Even the simple act of taking the crown had been tangled in betrayal and blood. Let's not forget the moment Edward VI died. Mary was not the automatic successor. The throne was almost stolen from her hands by those who feared what her Catholicism might bring. And when Lady Jane Grey, young, intelligent, and tragically malleable, was placed on the throne, Mary had to muster courage and troops to claim what was hers by right. That victory had felt like a miracle at the time. The daughter of a discarded queen, once labelled illegitimate and cast aside, had ridden into London to the thunder of church bells and cheers. For a brief moment she was triumphant, glorious, vindicated, but it didn't last. The decision to marry Philip of Spain might have been the beginning of the end, though it didn't seem so at first. Philip brought legitimacy and strength, on paper. He was, after all, the son of Emperor Charles V, ruler of a vast empire. But to the English people he was foreign, Catholic, and most damningly, uninterested. The marriage, intended to bolster Mary's reign, instead isolated her further. The wedding itself was subdued. Philip barely spoke the language. He left England mere months after the ceremony, and each of his rare returns was short and politically motivated. He brought no joy, no heir, only growing resentment from the court and whispers that Mary was being used. Even her own counsellors began to pull away, yet Mary persisted, clinging to her vision like a martyr in a storm. She believed to the end that a Catholic England was not only possible, but destined, that the people could be retaught, that their errors could be burned away, and so came the flames. The heresy trials were systematic, efficient and public. For each person burned there were others watching, sometimes thousands. The executions were meant as deterrents, but they often had the opposite effect. Instead of stamping out Protestantism, they turned victims into icons. Take Lawrence Saunders, a clergyman burned in 1555. He kissed the stake before being bound to it, and as the flames climbed he was heard repeating the words of Psalm 51. Or John Hooper, the Bishop of Gloucester, who was forced to wait for his fire to be lit while standing in snow. It took over 45 minutes for him to die. The public reaction was not always what Mary expected. Some wept, others prayed, a few jeered, but more often there was silence. Heavy, uncomfortable silence. And afterward, in the pubs and parlours, the people talked. About courage, about cruelty, about the meaning of faith when it comes wrapped in pain. Mary thought she was saving souls, but her subjects began to question what kind of salvation required such suffering. And therein lies the great tragedy of her rule. Not that she was harsh, many monarchs were. Not that she failed, many rulers do. But that she mistook fear for faith. She believed that by purifying the land with fire she would win it back for God. But what she created instead was a kingdom more divided, more suspicious, and more eager than ever to push Catholicism away. Still, let's not pretend the path before her had been easy. She inherited a country at odds with itself. The religious roller coaster of Henry VIII's break from Rome, followed by Edward VI's aggressive Protestantism, had left England spiritually fractured. Mary wanted to unify, to heal. She truly did. But she reached for the wrong tools. Where persuasion might have swayed hearts, she chose persecution. Where patience might have allowed gradual change, she applied pressure. And in doing so, she lit not just literal fires, but a figurative one beneath her own throne. What's often forgotten is that Mary's initial efforts weren't wholly unpopular. There were many, especially among the older generation, who welcomed the return of traditional Catholic practices. The rituals, the Latin liturgy, the visual richness of pre-Reformation worship held emotional resonance. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was comfort. But comfort quickly curdles when paired with terror. The arrest of Protestant pastors, the imprisonment of noble dissenters, the burning of common folk, all of it created an atmosphere not of religious revival, but of dread. And then came the phantom pregnancies. Twice Mary believed she was with child. Her belly swelled, her court prepared, prayers were offered, celebrations planned, but no child ever came. To her supporters, this was a test of faith. To her critics, it was proof of divine disfavour. To the court physicians, it was a mystery, or a carefully unspoken diagnosis. Was it a tumour, a hormonal imbalance, a desperate illusion? We'll never know. But what we do know is this: those false hopes shattered Mary. Each time the supposed labour passed with no baby, the court shifted further from her orbit. Each time Philip stayed away longer, and each time her determination to restore Catholicism intensified. The fires kept burning even as her health faded, and by the end she was not feared so much as pitied. She died alone, politically abandoned, personally broken, and religiously defiant to the last. Her final words are lost to time, but her last act spoke volumes. She left her crown not to a fellow Catholic but to Elizabeth, her Protestant half-sister, the very embodiment of everything she had tried to suppress. Even in death, Mary had to yield, and Elizabeth, clever as ever, used that inheritance to her full advantage. Under her, Mary's reign was reframed as a warning, a foil, a fire to be contrasted with the supposed light of the Elizabethan Golden Age. The narrative was carefully constructed. Mary represented darkness, tyranny, and religious excess. Elizabeth symbolised wisdom, peace, and balance. It was never that simple, of course. Elizabeth ruled through her own forms of suppression. She had spies in every parish. Her government fined and hounded recusant Catholics. Priests were arrested, interrogated, and executed under her laws. But her image management was superior. She gave no public burnings. She offered words instead of flames. And so, Mary's image never stood a chance. Her legacy was dragged through the centuries by Protestant historians, Victorian moralists, and even 20th century school textbooks. Always it was the same Bloody Mary, the mad queen, the fire starter. Her humanity boiled away, leaving only smoke. But beneath that smoke, the real woman still lingers. She was brilliant, educated, devout, resilient. The first woman to rule England in her own right, paving the way for queens to come, a child of heartbreak, a prisoner of her own convictions, a soul who burned brightest at the very moment her world turned to ash. She may never escape the flames history tied to her name, but perhaps, just perhaps, we can learn to see through the smoke. A pale sun rises over Oxford's skyline, casting long shadows across spires and gables. The city is still, its cobbled streets damp with morning mist. But history, as always, lingers here like perfume, clinging to chapel stones, whispering from behind oak-panelled doors. It was here, of course, that some of Mary's most infamous fires were lit, and even now, centuries later, the air sometimes feels heavy with remembrance. Though the executions have ceased, and the pyres long extinguished, the memory of what happened during Mary's reign still smoulders in places like this, and the echoes are particularly loud in Oxford, where Latimer, Ridley and Cranmer met their end. 3 Protestant bishops, 3 pillars of the Reformation, reduced to ash in the Queen's quest for religious unity. Their martyrdom wasn't just a tragic episode, it was a performance. Each burning was a public sermon delivered not by preacher, but by fire. The emotional weight of these executions did not fade. The common people, even those unsure of theology, understood what it meant to see a man chained to a stake, refusing to recant. The quiet dignity of those condemned created a counter-narrative, one that Mary's government couldn't control. And so, even as officials kept lighting matches, the real fire, the ideological one, began burning beneath the surface of society. Yet Mary, surrounded by loyal clerics and emboldened by her belief in righteous authority, likely never saw it. Or perhaps she did and believed it would pass. In her view, the problem was not the fire, it was the sin that made it necessary. To her, England had fallen into error. The people had been misled, deceived by smooth-tongued heretics. To burn a heretic was not to destroy a person, but to rescue a soul, often against its will. It's a disturbing logic, but one not unfamiliar in history. After all, Mary wasn't inventing persecution, she inherited it, and she wielded it with a sense of sacred duty. Still, as the executions multiplied, so did resistance. It wasn't open at first. England wasn't yet a place for bold rebellion. But the resistance crept through the cracks, in whispered prayers spoken in English, in smuggled books, handwritten and passed between trusted hands, in the naming of children after martyrs. One boy in Essex was named Latimer shortly after the bishop's execution. Another family, hiding a Protestant preacher in their barn, referred to him only as the guest. These were small acts, quiet ones, but collectively they formed a kind of spiritual insurgency. Historians still argue whether Mary's policies actually strengthened the Protestant cause. Some say yes, the burnings created martyrs, legends, and an enduring sense of identity. Others say no, the trauma of the persecution caused many to conform outwardly, even if belief simmered beneath the surface. What is certain is that the flames didn't produce converts. Mary's effort to force religious obedience may have worked for a moment, but it never reached hearts. People obeyed out of fear, not love, and as every teacher knows, fear has a short shelf life. It motivates, but only while the threat remains visible. Once the Queen was gone, her policies collapsed. But while the burnings were the most dramatic element of her reign, they weren't the only tool Mary employed. Her government also worked behind the scenes, censoring publications, banning Protestant books, revoking licenses to preach, and restoring monastic lands where possible. She sought reconciliation with Rome, and even welcomed the return of Cardinal Reginald Pole, her cousin, as Archbishop of Canterbury. Pole's presence was intended to symbolise healing, a return to tradition, lineage, and legitimacy. He had once been exiled under Henry VIII, a vocal critic of the schism with Rome. Now he returned as spiritual leader, tasked with reuniting England with the Holy See. But Pole brought with him a burden of expectation and disappointment. His efforts to rebuild Catholic infrastructure were hampered by time, money, and an increasingly suspicious populace. And just hours after Mary died, he too succumbed to illness, as though the cause they shared simply couldn't survive without her. Still, Mary pressed on during her life, insisting that England could be saved if she simply pushed harder. And so, her court became a place of contradictions, incense and interrogation, Latin chants and execution warrants. It was both chapel and courtroom, salvation and sentencing side by side. One visitor from Spain wrote that Mary spent more time in prayer than any ruler he had ever seen. Another noted that she seemed happiest when discussing matters of theology, not diplomacy. To her, politics was merely the vessel for a divine mission, and she steered that vessel with a firm hand, even as the crew quietly mutinied beneath the decks. As her popularity waned, so did her health. Mary's final years were steeped in melancholy. Her supposed pregnancies, hopeful at first, became sources of embarrassment and courtly mockery. Her marriage to Philip deteriorated into long silences and longer absences. Her body grew frail. She suffered from fever, bloating and pain in her legs, possibly edema, or the result of ovarian cysts. Some accounts suggest she could barely walk without assistance, but she never let go of her mission. She continued to correspond with Rome, to order arrests, to oversee policy. She insisted that England was being tested, that suffering would yield grace. And when news came that Calais had fallen, the last English possession in France, it shattered her completely. Calais wasn't just a territory, it was pride, history, proof that England still had a place on the European stage. Its loss to Mary was not only military but symbolic. She reportedly said, "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." Whether she truly said it is uncertain, but the sentiment is believable. It encapsulates everything about Mary duty, loss, and the bitter taste of a kingdom slipping away. By late 1558, her days were numbered. Confessors visited often. She received last rites. She clutched a crucifix until her fingers could no longer close around it. There were no more illusions of pregnancy, no letters from Philip, only the slow fade of power and the growing certainty that her dream was dying with her. She named Elizabeth as her successor. It was perhaps her final defeat. She had spent years trying to prevent Protestant rule, and yet in her last moments she passed the crown to the very person who would erase her reforms. Still, she hoped. Hoped that Elizabeth would keep some Catholic practices. Hoped that the fires had not been in vain, but they had. Elizabeth moved quickly to reverse Mary's changes. The Latin Mass vanished. The Book of Common Prayer returned. The country pivoted toward Protestantism with startling speed, as though exhaling after years of holding breath. Yet Mary's name did not vanish. Instead, it grew into something else entirely. A spectre, a symbol, a shorthand for all that was wrong with religious zeal, for excess, for intolerance. Even in death she couldn't escape the fire. And what's perhaps most tragic is that the burnings, those horrifying spectacles that defined her reign, were not inevitable. She might have ruled differently. She might have chosen reform over repression. But she didn't. And once the executions began, they became unstoppable. There was a point, historians debate exactly when, where Mary could have pulled back, where she might have shifted strategy, tempered her tactics, even negotiated coexistence. But she saw hesitation as weakness, mercy, perhaps, as betrayal, and so she burned her way deeper into conviction until there was no path out. By the time she died, her kingdom was tired, not just of religion, but of fear. The fires had scorched not only flesh, but the soul of a nation, and centuries later, when children dare each other to chant her name in front of a mirror, they aren't thinking about history. Not really. They're invoking a legend, a ghost queen, a woman who believed she was saving the world and instead became one of its most terrifying reflections. The real Mary Tudor, daughter of kings, defender of faith, lonely architect of a burning dream, lies buried in Westminster beside the sister who undid her. But her story still smoulders. By the late 1550s, the burnings have become as routine as the changing of the seasons. The Queen's writs, signed and sealed, pass through hands slick with nervous sweat. Bishops announce another heretic to be examined. Local magistrates ready the stake. Town criers ring their bells. Another name, another execution, and the people they come. Not always willingly, but they come. In villages like Hadley, Uxbridge and Lewis, it becomes a part of life, something you attend like a grim sermon. A boy pulls at his mother's skirts, asking why the man on the pyre sings. A merchant mutters under his breath, "God help us all," and looks away. A widow clutches a locket, whispering a silent prayer not to be next. These aren't rebels or saints, just regular folk caught in a kingdom trying to purify its soul by fire. But let's step back and look at the numbers, though Mary would never have framed them that way. Nearly 300 people are executed during her reign for religious heresy, the vast majority by burning. About 80 of them are women. They're of all ages, from young apprentices barely old enough to shave, to elderly widows who can no longer walk without help. A few are priests or scholars, but most are tradesmen, housewives, farmers, cobblers, shepherds. Their crime refusing to believe that the bread and wine truly become the body and blood of Christ. Yes, that's the central issue. The doctrine of transubstantiation becomes the measuring stick of loyalty. It is a theological idea so simple to state, and yet, to many Protestants, blasphemous to believe. They say Christ is present spiritually, symbolically, but Mary's Church demands literal belief. And when they say no, quietly, firmly, that's enough. Consider Agnes Snoth of Kent, burned alongside 3 others in 1557. A widow and weaver, her trial records show she refused to attend Mass, stating plainly, "I will not deny my Saviour for any man's pleasure." She wasn't grand, she wasn't famous, but she stood her ground. Or William Hunter, a 19-year-old apprentice from Brentwood. He was caught reading the Bible in English, arrested, tried, offered freedom if he would recant. He declined. His brother later wrote that William walked to the stake with such a cheerful countenance as if he were going to a banquet. These stories begin to add up, not in Mary's ledgers, but in the hearts of her people. Every execution has its witnesses, and every witness becomes a carrier of the tale. A woman who saw her neighbour die tells it to her children. A traveller spreads it to another village. A scribe writes it down. A preacher recounts it in a field. What Mary intends as a purging becomes a kind of printing press, stamping the Protestant cause into the collective imagination. And central to this growing narrative is a man with a pen, John Foxe. His Book of Martyrs, published in 1563 under Elizabeth's reign, becomes the definitive chronicle of Protestant suffering under Mary. It is not neutral, it is not subtle, it paints her as monstrous, a queen drenched in blood, guided by Spanish priests and demonic advisors, but it's also effective. The book is filled with woodcuts, stark black and white images of men and women burning at stakes, hands clasped in prayer, soldiers standing grim-faced with torches. These images become visual shorthand for Mary's reign. More than any speech or proclamation, these pages shape her legacy. Parliament orders Foxe's book to be chained in every church. It becomes required reading, a holy relic in its own right. Generations grow up knowing the names of the martyrs better than those of their own grandparents. And so, a peculiar dynamic takes root in post-Marian England. Mary becomes more powerful dead than alive. Her reign, so brief in the long sweep of Tudor history, becomes an anchor point. Everything after her is measured by contrast. Elizabeth's moderate Protestantism feels like relief not because it's gentle, but because it isn't fire. And yet, despite her vilification, there's something compelling about Mary. Something that keeps scholars circling back, peering through the smoke. Because beneath the cruelty was a woman who genuinely believed she was saving her people. A woman who had endured abandonment, humiliation, and political exile. Who had seen her mother cast aside, her own title stripped, and her faith mocked. Who had finally, improbably, claimed the throne, and then tried to rebuild a nation in her mother's image. That desperation, that passion, bled into every decision. Take her treatment of the Tower prisoners. Many of the condemned were offered chances to recant. Some were visited repeatedly by priests, given ample time to change their minds. The pressure was intense, but it wasn't always swift. Mary didn't want to execute them. She wanted them to repent. In her mind, a saved soul was worth more than any spectacle. But the ones who refused... She made examples of them. She believed the fires would show others the cost of rebellion. That the sight of flame would ignite fear, and through fear, obedience, and through obedience, salvation. It's easy now to condemn that logic. But it was not alien in her time. The idea of corporal punishment as moral correction was widespread. Public execution was not rare, it was policy. And while the burnings of Mary's reign were excessive, they weren't entirely out of step with the age. Still, something about fire is different. It lingers in the senses longer than the hangman's rope. It stains memory more than the sword. It's both elemental and symbolic, and when Mary chose fire, she chose to etch her rule into the bones of her people. Even her own supporters began to hesitate. In 1557, reports emerged of executioners growing uncomfortable with their duties. One man broke down after burning 3 women in one day. A magistrate in Essex requested to be reassigned. The weight of these deaths, mounting month by month, was not lost on those tasked with delivering them, and by this point Philip had withdrawn almost entirely. The Spanish alliance that Mary had so desperately pursued bore no fruit, no child, no real political gain. Philip returned to Spain, absorbed in continental wars. He wrote to Mary rarely and visited even less. She remained his wife in name, but politically she stood alone. That isolation deepened her conviction. She doubled down on devotion, retreating further into prayer, confession, and ritual. Her chambers became more chapel than royal suite, her clothing darker, her circle smaller, and so the final phase of her reign was a kind of spiritual siege. Her, hunkered down in her convictions, while the country slowly moved beyond her reach. By the time she fell ill in 1558, many courtiers had already turned their eyes to Elizabeth. The transition, though tense, was smoother than anyone expected. Mary died in November, and within hours the machinery of monarchy turned toward her half-sister. The altars were cleared, the Latin was replaced, the Mass was shortened, the fires stopped. But the burnings had already done their work. Mary's reign taught England how to fear, but also how to remember. The people, it turned out, remembered the screams. They remembered the woodpiles. And they remembered the silence of neighbours too afraid to speak. That fear carved itself into English identity, and it created a firewall that no future Catholic monarch would ever overcome. Even centuries later, when kings and queens came and went, Mary's shadow flickered just behind the throne. She became the unspoken reference, the cautionary tale. Not because she was the only one to kill for faith, but because she believed that only through fire could heaven be found. By now, the bonfires in the town squares are history, but the warmth they once gave off lingers uncomfortably in the nation's memory. The smoke no longer chokes the streets, but in the minds of England's citizens, those who lived through it and those who heard the stories passed down, it still curls around every church door, every parish sermon, every moment someone is told what to believe. The final burnings under Mary's reign took place in 1558, not long before her own death. By then the rhythm had become tragically familiar. Arrest, trial, refusal to recant, condemnation, execution, and always the public spectacle. The government no longer even had to explain itself. The rules were set, the expectations clear, the fear automatic. Some historians count the last official victim as Alice Driver, a farmer's daughter from Suffolk who died alongside a woman named Alexander Gooch. They were executed together in Ipswich. Alice, known for her wit and fearlessness, reportedly laughed at her interrogators and accused her judges of damning their own souls. She refused to be cowed, even as the flames climbed her skirt. That defiance, so common among the condemned, might have been the final nail in Mary's hopes of convincing the public that the fires were righteous. Each burning, rather than cementing obedience, instead made the heretics look heroic. The Crown's attempt to crush Protestantism through terror only served to immortalise its adherents, and Europe was watching. Foreign diplomats reported home not only on England's religious whiplash, but also on its queen. Mary's reputation abroad shifted rapidly. Early in her reign, she'd been admired in Catholic courts. Her piety, her resolve, her restoration of ties with Rome all earned her applause. But by the end, even Catholic allies began to feel uneasy. The Pope at the time, Paul IV, initially saw Mary as a champion of orthodoxy. But their relationship soured quickly. Paul, fiery and uncompromising, clashed with Mary over political alliances, especially her ties to Spain. He distrusted Philip and by extension the English crown. Mary, caught between obedience to Rome and loyalty to her husband, found herself isolated even among those who should have been her greatest supporters, and that isolation seeped into every part of her governance. Her court became less a centre of politics and more a cloister of ritual. She surrounded herself with confessors, bishops, and advisers whose focus matched her own, the soul of England. But outside that circle, political energy shifted elsewhere. Parliament began to resist more frequently, nobles began to plot more quietly, and courtiers began to measure their words more carefully. Still, Mary didn't slow. To the end, she believed her burnings were acts of mercy, not cruelty, not revenge, but salvation. She saw herself as a shepherd, herding stubborn sheep back into the fold, even if they had to be dragged through flame to get there. And it's here that the full weight of her tragedy becomes clear. Because Mary wasn't tyrannical in the way later despots would be. She didn't revel in violence, she wasn't sadistic. Her cruelty was born not of indulgence but of belief. She thought she was saving people, that her enemies were already damned and that she, by showing strength, could prevent others from following them. This is perhaps the hardest truth to swallow. Mary Tudor wasn't evil, she was devout. And that devotion, untempered by doubt or dissent, became the firewood for history's judgment. As the executions came to a halt, the mood in the country shifted again. The populace, once cowed, began to murmur more openly. Clergy who had stayed silent now began cautiously preaching against persecution. Families who had conformed for safety started slipping away to secret gatherings. The Protestant exiles, those who had fled to Geneva, Strasbourg and Zurich during Mary's rule, began preparing to return. Many of them came back with sharper ideas and clearer theology. Years abroad had radicalised them. They didn't want to simply restore Edward's Protestantism. They wanted to deepen it, purify it. The Marian fires, instead of stamping out dissent, had forged a harder steel. Among these returning exiles were men like John Knox, who would help spark the Scottish Reformation, and Miles Coverdale, one of the early translators of the Bible into English. They brought with them not only texts, but momentum. The age of quiet compromise was over. Mary's reign had turned religion into a battlefield, and Elizabeth's would continue the war, albeit with a quieter blade. But before that new queen could rule, Mary had to die. Her final days were lonely, even within her palatial rooms. Her health declined sharply after the loss of Calais. Fever set in, her belly swelled again, another false hope of pregnancy, or perhaps a tumour. She grew lethargic, unable to rise from bed. Those closest to her reported that she prayed constantly, sometimes incoherently, whispering Latin phrases under her breath. And when death finally came, it was not greeted with mourning, but relief. London did not erupt into grief. The streets were not draped in black. The bells tolled, yes, but not all in sorrow. Some rang with quiet anticipation. Elizabeth was proclaimed queen with swift precision. The court shifted overnight. Mass was suspended. Statues were hidden. Bishops who had thrived under Mary either fled or fell silent. And just like that, it was over. Mary was buried in Westminster Abbey with ceremony but little fanfare. A Latin inscription was placed above her tomb. Later, Elizabeth would be buried in the same vault, and her name would be etched above Mary's. Today, visitors walk past the spot, most unaware that beneath their feet lie two queens, sisters in blood, strangers in belief. One of them left an empire in flames, the other a legacy of golden myth. Yet the question remains, did the fires work? If Mary's goal was to restore England to Catholicism permanently, then no. Her policies collapsed almost instantly. The people, tired of fear and smoke, embraced Elizabeth's reforms with remarkable speed. But if Mary's aim was to purify her own conscience, to finish what her mother had started, then perhaps, tragically, she succeeded. She died believing that she had served God, that she had saved souls, that the pain she inflicted would bloom into grace, and that belief, that unshakable, absolute conviction, is what makes her so terrifying. History remembers tyrants who acted from malice, but Mary acted from love, or what she thought was love. The kind of love that burns when challenged, that scorches when defied, that lights the path to heaven, even if the path is through hell. And that's what made her legacy so potent, because the people she tried to destroy didn't just survive, they became legends, and the queen who lit the fires. She became the warning etched in their flames. They gather early, before the first light bends over the London rooftops, before the morning cocks crow in the alleys. A small crowd forms in Smithfield, mostly silent, some clutching children too young to understand what they're about to witness. Others stand stiffly, hands folded, murmuring prayers under their breath. A few carry lanterns, a few carry doubts, and then, into the grey fog, the condemned are brought. 2 men and a woman this time, local artisans known to some in the crowd. They are marched with ropes around their wrists, escorted by armed guards, eyes downcast but not pleading. They've refused to recant, refused the Queen's mercy, which is no mercy at all, so they will burn. The fire is built with precision, dry wood, brush, straw at the base. The stakes are already in place, thick and blackened from countless burnings past. The executioners work methodically, almost casually, as if dressing a stage, and in a way that's what this has become theatre. The public execution of heretics under Queen Mary isn't just punishment, it's performance. A deliberate spectacle meant to frighten, to sway, to show the cost of dissent, a human warning sign. And just like the hundreds before them, these 3 will become symbols whether they want to or not. But something's changed in the atmosphere. These burnings, once accepted, or even cheered by some corners of the population, are beginning to sour. The crowds are smaller now, the cheers are quieter, the air is heavier, as if the weight of accumulated ash is pressing down on everyone watching. Because at this point the message isn't working anymore. What was once seen as righteous purification now feels like cruelty. The Queen's enemies have learned to wear martyrdom like armour. They don't cry, they don't curse, they sing, and the singing is louder than the flames. Take Thomas Whittle, burned in 1556. He sings psalms as the fire eats through his legs. He praises Christ through the crackling of bone. Or Elizabeth Warne, a weaver's wife from Stratford-le-Bow. She tells the crowd that she fears not death, but silence. "I burn with joy," she says, "for truth shall not die with me." These words spread. The woodcut prints spread. The names spread. Martyrdom becomes contagious. And Mary's campaign begins to backfire. Her trusted bishop, Edmund Bonner, once loyal and tireless, is now viewed by many as a butcher. His court in London has grown infamous, and the people nickname him Bloody Bonner. He oversees dozens of executions, often personally questioning the accused. He believes he's doing the Lord's work. But even fellow Catholics begin to murmur that his zeal feels more like vengeance. The Queen herself, meanwhile, rarely comments publicly on the executions. She leaves the details to her bishops, her judges, her councils. But she signs the warrants. She reads the reports, and when pressed, she defends her policy. "Better their bodies perish," she's said to remark, than that their souls be lost. It's a chilling logic, one echoed by inquisitors across the continent during this period. But in England, it feels different, because Mary is not some far-off pope's enforcer. She is their queen, a woman raised in their royal halls, now using the state to cleanse the soul. That dissonance gnaws at the people, especially because they know her story. They remember the little princess, abandoned when Henry tossed aside Catherine of Aragon. They remember the pale teenager forced to deny her own mother's marriage. The princess made a bastard, the girl who clung to her faith like a raft. They know she's not heartless. They know she's not mad, and that perhaps makes it worse. The fire isn't random. It's purposeful, thoughtful, calculated, and in time, numbing. By 1557, the kingdom is weary. The harvests have failed again. Plague stalks the countryside. War with France drains the treasury, and the loss of Calais humiliates the court. Philip, Mary's husband and political lifeline, is gone once more, summoned to fight on behalf of Spain, his true love. He writes little, returns never. And Mary, childless, alone, and increasingly sick, turns ever inward. She doubles down on devotion, prayer, confession, fasting. Her chambers fill with relics, crucifixes, icons. Candles burn day and night. She walks with difficulty. Her appetite wanes, but still she governs. Still she signs. Still the fires burn. But even among her inner circle, the loyalty is fraying. Members of her privy council begin quietly urging restraint. Some plead with her to consider less lethal methods, to slow the burnings, to try persuasion. She listens, then ignores them. Because to Mary, half measures are betrayal. Her entire reign is a crusade, and crusades demand sacrifice. But she's losing control of the narrative. In Antwerp, Geneva, and Strasbourg, English Protestant exiles publish tracts condemning the Marian regime. They smuggle these back into England, cleverly hidden in crates of cloth or barrels of wine. Once inside, they spread like wildfire. The stories are gruesome, detailed, and most dangerously illustrated. The most notorious of these is Acts and Monuments, what would later be called Fox's Book of Martyrs. Its accounts are not merely factual, they are emotional, filled with imagery, dialogue, and pathos. They read like a gospel of suffering, a rebuke of tyranny. And though the book won't be widely printed until Elizabeth's reign, the manuscript circulates underground. It feeds the fire of memory, even as Mary's literal fires begin to dwindle. By the end of 1558, fewer burnings occur, not because the law has changed, but because Mary's energy is fading. Her body swells again, another phantom pregnancy. Her physicians are baffled. Tumours, dropsy, ovarian cancer. No one can say for sure. She rarely leaves her bed. Her skin greys. Her appetite disappears. She dreams, some say, of her mother, of Spain, of children she'll never have. And outside her chamber, London begins to move on. People speak more freely. Preachers test the limits of their pulpits. Even Parliament becomes bolder. The mood is shifting, not with revolt, but with resolve. They've seen the worst, they've survived the fire, and they're already looking to the future. In her last act of power, Mary names Elizabeth as her successor. It's not a choice she makes gladly, but she sees no alternative. She prays, naively, that her sister will continue some form of Catholic policy, that the burnings will not have been in vain, that England, scorched but purified, will stay the course. She dies on November 17th, 1558, quietly, without fanfare, without Philip, no child, no legacy, no golden age, just the echo of prayers and the smell of old wax. Her body lies in state at Westminster Abbey, where eventually she will be buried beneath the floor. Years later, Elizabeth will be interred in the same tomb. Their epitaph will read, in Latin, partners in throne and grave. Here sleep two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of resurrection. A beautiful lie. Because while their bodies rest side by side, their souls, at least in the eyes of their subjects, couldn't be further apart. Elizabeth will rule for 44 years. She will end the burnings, restore the Protestant Church, defeat the Spanish Armada, and become a symbol of national pride. She will be adored, studied, mythologized. Mary will not. Mary becomes the Queen of Ashes, the woman in black, the whisper behind every warning, the reason why, centuries later, children still chant Bloody Mary into mirrors, hoping to see her face and fearing that they will. But what they see, if they see anything at all, is not the real Mary, not the child who loved music, not the girl who mourned her mother, not the woman who prayed for a child every day of her reign. They see the fire, and only the fire. In the quiet years that followed Mary's death, England seemed to breathe differently. Cautiously at first, like a patient stepping out of a long fever. The bonfires no longer burned, the church doors no longer creaked with dread, and the air, for the first time in nearly 6 years, smelled only of wood smoke from hearths, and not of charred flesh. But that doesn't mean the memory disappeared. Far from it. The scent lingered in the national imagination, in every whispered prayer, and in every glance toward the parish pulpit where new voices replaced the old. Mary's reign was over, but the debate about her motives, her legacy, and her morality had only just begun. In some circles, she was still referred to as Her Grace, or Good Queen Mary, particularly among staunch Catholics. These holdouts, clustered in isolated pockets across England's western and northern counties, lit candles in secret, preserved Latin prayer books behind walls, and muttered old hymns into their sleeves. For them, Mary had been a last flicker of light in what now seemed an ever-darkening Protestant age. They spoke of her with reverence, painting her portrait not as a fanatic, but as a saint undone by the world's cruelty. But their voices were quickly drowned out. Under Elizabeth, the tide of public opinion was carefully redirected. It was not enough to forget Mary. She had to be unlearned, unmade. Her reign reframed as aberration, her faith labelled as superstition. Her fires remembered not as acts of conviction, but of carnage. And the architects of this erasure were not just political, they were literary, theological, and cultural. Fox's Book of Martyrs became the centrepiece of this effort. It was more than a chronicle. It was a cathedral in text, built from the bones of Mary's victims. Each account was meticulously dramatic, with heavy emphasis on the piety of the condemned and the callousness of their persecutors. It painted Mary's England as a hellish realm, where innocent men and women were snatched from their homes and offered no choice but death or damnation, where smoke curled up from cobblestones daily, and where even children learned to speak Latin not in schools but in courtrooms as they stood trial. This image, once planted, rooted deeply. Children were taught these stories alongside scripture. Sermons quoted them. Plays hinted at them. Even stained glass windows were commissioned in memory of those lost. Not kings or nobles, but cobblers, farmers, seamstresses, regular people, elevated by fire into saints of the new faith, and Mary she became the anti-saint. The stories grew stranger with each telling. Some claimed she drank wine during executions. Others said she personally ordered the burning of pregnant women, or laughed as smoke rose into her windows. These were, of course, fabrications, but that hardly mattered. Once she was made a villain, facts became optional. But let's not forget the historical Mary was far more complicated. She wasn't cruel for sport. She didn't enjoy the fire. She didn't wield her authority recklessly. In fact, many of her policies were methodical, legalistic, even bureaucratically restrained. Each heretic's death came after trial, review, a chance to recant. That doesn't make the executions right, but it makes them different from later witch hunts or revolutionary guillotines. They weren't chaotic, they were institutional, and therein lies part of the horror, because cruelty wrapped in ritual doesn't feel like passion, it feels like policy. The machine Mary built didn't run on rage, it ran on doctrine. It was tidy, clean, and unrelenting. Still, in moments, even Mary seemed shaken. Even Mary. Records show that she occasionally questioned the necessity of certain burnings. She sometimes delayed executions. She consulted her confessors with evident anguish. But at the end of the day, she returned to her convictions. To hesitate, she believed, was to open the door to heresy. And once opened, that door would never close. So she kept it bolted with fire. But outside the palace, the tide had already turned. As the years passed, fewer people attended the burnings voluntarily. The cheers faded, the jeers grew hollow, and by the last months of Mary's reign, public sympathy had shifted almost entirely to the victims. It wasn't the theology that won people over, it was the humanity. Mothers burning beside daughters, elderly men who couldn't walk without a cane dragged to the stake, teenagers reciting the Lord's Prayer while their skin peeled away. These weren't political agitators, they were neighbours, and their stories endured. What Mary couldn't anticipate was how powerfully martyrdom works in reverse. She sought to silence them forever. Instead, she gave them eternal voice. Their names, etched into parish walls, echoed louder than any sermon. Even in popular culture, the resonance of Mary's reign persisted. Plays written under Elizabeth and later Stuart monarchs often included veiled allusions to her. The Queen who painted England in smoke, or the red-robed daughter of Rome, became tropes, and eventually the nickname was born Bloody Mary. It didn't become common until much later, probably not until the early 17th century. But once coined, it stuck. Like dried blood, it wouldn't wash out. And the name, so stark, so vivid, became the lens through which all her actions were viewed. Yet not everyone accepted the simplification. Some Catholic historians pushed back. They pointed out that Henry VIII, Edward VI, and even Elizabeth executed people for religious reasons. They noted that Mary's reign was far from the bloodiest in European history. They emphasised her charity, her support of hospitals, her aid to the poor. They argued that her intentions, however flawed, were sincere, and they were right, partially. But sincerity is no shield against consequence. For every coin she distributed to a beggar, another stake was built in a marketplace. For every mass she attended in solemn reverence, another Protestant family wept over a loved one's execution. Her piety, while genuine, was accompanied by pain. The public couldn't forget that, nor could they forget the faces of the condemned. And so Mary's memory fractured. To some, she remained the last true Catholic monarch of England, a daughter of Aragon who tried to reverse a tidal wave with her bare hands, a tragic figure, a woman of devotion undone by the politics of gender, religion, and inheritance. To others, she was a cautionary tale, proof of what happens when belief goes unchecked, when religion and power become indistinguishable, when conviction drowns compassion. And to the wider world her name became something else entirely, a whisper, a dare, a reflection. The Mirror legend began centuries later, likely in America, far removed from Mary's court and England's cobbled streets. It was a folk tale, a party game, a superstition twisted from the past. Say her name 3 times in front of a mirror in the dark, and she would appear, bloody, vengeful, wrathful. Not the Queen, the ghost. This version bore no resemblance to the historical Mary. No crucifix, no crown, no sorrowful eyes, just blood and glass and fear. Yet even that myth had power, born from centuries of half-remembered horrors and dramatised histories. And still, beneath all the distortions, the real woman waits. A queen who tried to be good, who tried to do what was right, who believed, too deeply and too rigidly, that salvation came only through pain. She ruled with a steady hand. With us, she wept in private. She prayed more than she smiled. And in the end, she died surrounded by altars, not applause. Her story is not easily categorized. It is not simply a tale of villainy, nor of virtue. It's not about one woman's madness, or one era's cruelty. It's a meditation on belief, how it can blind, inspire, comfort, and consume, and how even the best intentions, when stripped of mercy, can become monstrous. Mary Tudor didn't want to be remembered as Bloody Mary. She wanted to be remembered as a queen who saved her people. But history, unforgiving, unsentimental, had other plans. By the time Mary's name has fully congealed into legend, the kingdom she once ruled has transformed almost beyond recognition. The England of the 1560s and beyond bears little resemblance to the smouldering realm she left behind. The Protestant Church of England is now the new norm, reshaped and hardened by the trauma of her reign. But while the country moves forward, her name is dragged behind, tethered like a warning bell, always ringing, always just a whisper away from flame. Yet even those who most feared her cannot ignore one central truth she ruled with conviction. That's a rare thing in any monarch, especially a woman, especially in Tudor England, where female rulers were still viewed with squinting suspicion. Even Elizabeth, brilliant and politically gifted, cloaked much of her power behind symbols of virginity and submission to God. But Mary ruled directly, openly, fiercely. She didn't hide her hand. She didn't bend to popularity. She chose a course and followed it, even as the wind howled in the other direction, and that terrified people, not just because of what she did, but because she believed in it so deeply. By her own admission, Mary viewed herself as a saviour, not politically, spiritually. Her mission wasn't merely to govern, it was to correct, to purify, to restore England to what she saw as its rightful place in the arms of the true church. She prayed for strength, for guidance, and for her people. But she never prayed for compromise, and that single-mindedness, noble or not, became a fire of its own. She was surrounded by advisers who disagreed, officials who winced at every execution order, foreign allies who gradually backed away from her intensity. Even her husband, Philip of Spain, spent more time abroad than at her side. Letters from his court in Madrid reveal that he found her too stubborn, too pious, too determined. He respected her, but he did not love her, and he certainly didn't stay. Mary felt that abandonment acutely. She had married not for passion, but for partnership, for Catholic legacy, for an heir. But Philip's absence became a constant ache. She believed again and again that she was pregnant. Her doctors confirmed it. The palace prepared for a prince. England held its breath, but nothing came, and each time the illusion shattered, Mary retreated further into faith, into herself. She lit candles for hours, attended Mass daily, wore black even when court expected colour. Her world narrowed, and with it, her tolerance. It's in this late period, perhaps the final 2 years of her reign, that the burnings grow darker in tone, not in number necessarily, but in desperation. They begin to feel like exorcisms, a queen trying not just to protect her people, but to purge something inside herself. Her counsellors saw it. They began to shift uncomfortably in her presence. Even Bonner, the ever-zealous bishop, showed signs of fatigue. And the people, they had long since turned. Not toward rebellion, but something quieter avoidance. They stopped attending burnings when they could help it. They whispered about the victims with less judgment, more sorrow. And in the cold of the markets and the taverns, they began to hope that this time perhaps the Queen herself might burn out before they did. When she finally did die, the change in the air was immediate. Elizabeth's coronation was swift and strategic. It wasn't just about reclaiming a throne, it was about reclaiming identity. The English people, newly unshackled from the smoke, rushed toward a future of tolerance, though, of course, that would prove only relative. Elizabethan rule had its own brand of religious suppression, but compared to the pyres, it felt like sunlight. And yet, even as England looked forward, it couldn't fully forget. Because Mary's victims were not names etched in the elite tombs. They were everyday people, which meant everyone knew someone, or knew someone who had suffered under her fire. The trauma spread not through official records, but through memory. A butcher in York remembered the smell of wet hair burning. A young girl in Canterbury still saw flames in her dreams. A former servant, once forced to attend a burning with his master, woke at night shaking from the echo of screams. And in this way, Mary became immortal, not in glory, but in guilt. Still, as the decades passed, that guilt hardened into myth. Mary the woman disappeared behind Mary the warning, and in that transformation, something was lost. Because while she did burn over 280 Protestants, more than any other English monarch, the full story isn't only in the number, it's in the why. That's what makes her legacy so difficult to pin down. Because while tyrants throughout history have ruled with cruelty, Mary ruled with belief. Her victims were not enemies of the crown, but of doctrine. She didn't burn them because she hated them. She burned them because she feared for them. She believed, truly believed, that their souls were in peril, and that her duty as queen, as God's anointed, was to save them, even if they screamed, even if they begged, even if their children watched them die. That's a terrifying kind of love. And yet, it's also deeply human, flawed, fragile, aching. It's easy to paint her in black and white, a villain in velvet, a ghost in the glass. But the real Mary was all shades of grey. She wept for her failures. She clutched letters from her long-dead mother. She begged for her husband's return. She prayed for a child who would never come. She wanted to be remembered as a redeemer, a healer, a queen who corrected the sins of her father's generation and restored England to grace. But what she left was scorched earth, and in that charred soil her enemies planted seeds. Protestantism didn't die with the burnings. It rooted deeper, hardened, reformed. The very people she tried to extinguish rose from the ashes as stronger symbols. Not just martyrs, but heroes. Not just survivors, but missionaries. By the time the next century rolled around, England was a firmly Protestant nation. The idea of returning to Rome seemed almost laughable. And Mary, poor Mary, became a ghost story. Worse, she became a cautionary tale. She was invoked not as a queen, but as a shadow. A memory summoned in parliamentary debates and whispered in the ears of rebellious preachers. "Don't forget Bloody Mary," they'd say. "Don't let it happen again." And then, somewhere along the way, she stepped out of history altogether and into folklore. In the centuries that followed, Mary's name became something else entirely. A figure of mirror games, sleepover dares, and whispered chants. Bloody Mary became unmoored from her true story. The fire was replaced by blood, the queen by a vengeful ghost. Children stared into mirrors in the dark, expecting to see her eyes. Not sad, not prayerful, but empty. Dead. Watching. And still, no one really knew what she wanted. Revenge, justice. A child to be understood. The mirror never answers, and maybe that's fitting, because Mary's legacy is a mirror itself. It reflects the fears of those who gaze into it. For the Protestants of the Elizabethan age, she was a tyrant. For Catholic loyalists, a fallen saint. For modern audiences, a misunderstood monarch, and for children playing in the dark, a monster. But the truth, she was just a woman, a daughter, a wife, a queen, and a believer who let her belief set the world on fire. The palace is quiet now. No prayers echo through the halls, no incense clouds the corridors. The wax from votive candles once lit for the Queen has long since cooled. Mary Tudor, once monarch, now memory, rests beneath the flagstones of Westminster, far below the feet of curious tourists who shuffle past without pause. The woman who hoped to save England's soul has herself been consigned to history's shadows, her legacy stitched together from ash, silence, and the flicker of uncertain flame. But what remains when the fires are gone as Elizabeth's reign solidifies, Mary's story becomes less about her life and more about what she failed to do. And chief among those failures, more haunting even than the hundreds of burnings, is her inability to produce an heir. This failure wasn't just political, it was personal. It haunted her in ways no counsellor could counsel away. Every false pregnancy, every swelling belly that yielded only disappointment, chipped away at her hope. For a queen whose legitimacy had once been stripped away by questions of her mother's fertility, the irony was bitter. The first supposed pregnancy had caused elation across the land. Bells rang, cradles were crafted, midwives were summoned. But as the months passed and no labour came, court physicians began to hedge. They spoke of delays, of unusual conditions. Mary herself remained hopeful, if increasingly withdrawn. When it finally became clear that no child would come, a kind of silence settled over her court. No explanation was ever offered, no apology, only the growing sense that the future had already slipped from her grasp, and yet she tried again. A second pregnancy announcement arrived not long after. This time the celebration was more muted. Parliament waited, foreign ambassadors held their breath. Mary grew more reclusive, whispering prayers over her belly, clutching relics to her chest. Again her body betrayed her, and again no child came. To her subjects, the absence of an heir wasn't just a political inconvenience, it was an omen. Without a Catholic successor, all her efforts could be undone, and as Mary's health declined, that fear became certainty. Elizabeth was waiting. The younger half-sister, carefully kept at arm's length throughout Mary's reign, had become a symbol to Protestants. She was intelligent, charming, and, most importantly, silent. She kept her head down, said the right things, attended Mass when required, wrote careful letters of submission, but everyone knew her heart-tilted Protestant. Mary certainly did. And yet, as her strength faded and no alternative appeared, Mary was forced to name Elizabeth her successor. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Mary, who had lit fires to prevent Protestant rule, now handed the kingdom to a Protestant queen. She did so quietly, with no public drama, just the slow, reluctant acceptance that her mission, her sacred divine mission, had failed. Even in her final days she clung to ritual. Latin prayers were murmured at her bedside. Confessors came and went in silence. Her rosary never left her fingers. Some said she spoke often of her mother, Catherine of Aragon, another queen who had fought for love and lost. Perhaps Mary found some comfort in that connection, knowing her suffering wasn't solitary. When she died on November 17th, 1558, the world barely stirred. No riots, no public weeping, no candlelit vigils. The crown passed almost instantly to Elizabeth. The transition was so smooth, so immediate, that it seemed rehearsed. In some ways, it was. The court had been preparing for this moment for months, perhaps years. As Mary's body was prepared for burial, Elizabeth was already charting a new course. And what of Mary's funeral? It was solemn, dignified, but stripped of grandeur. Elizabeth allowed her sister a proper Catholic ceremony, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of strategy. But it was clear from the outset this was not a passing of the torch. It was a closing of a chapter. Mary was buried in Westminster Abbey, not in a grand tomb of her own, but eventually beneath a shared slab with Elizabeth. Their epitaph, carved years later, speaks of partnership, consorts in throne and grave. But the message is misleading. They were not partners, they were rivals, ideological opposites, sisters by blood but strangers in belief. Elizabeth would rule for more than 4 decades. Her reign would be romanticised, gilded in legend, bolstered by military victory and artistic flourish. Under her, the Church of England would become a permanent fixture. The fires of Mary's reign would fade into memory, but not disappear. They would fester. For Protestants, the stories of the Marian martyrs became central to identity. These were not just religious figures, they were national symbols, victims of foreign influence, defenders of English truth. Fox's Book of Martyrs ensured their stories were immortalised. It became a core text, second only to the Bible in many homes. In a way, Mary gave English Protestantism the very thing it had lacked: a pantheon of martyrs, and herself the perfect villain. She wasn't a distant king, she wasn't a faceless council, she was a woman, a queen, someone who had once smiled from coinage, who had ridden through cheering crowds, who had promised unity and delivered only fire. The contradiction made her irresistible to storytellers. Playwrights turned her into a madwoman, ballads painted her as a bloody-handed bride. Even the early histories, written under Elizabeth's supervision, emphasised her failures, her fanaticism, her inability to bend, and yet there were always voices that resisted the caricature. Some Catholic thinkers, particularly in Europe, remembered her differently. They saw her as courageous, noble, unflinching in the face of a crumbling world. They called her a virgin martyr, praised her for reuniting England with Rome, and mourned her early death as a divine injustice. There were even rumours, whispered in far-off monasteries, that she might one day be canonised. Of course, it never happened. Too much blood, too much smoke, too many memories that wouldn't wash away. Still, the idea lingers that Mary was not evil, but broken. Not bloodthirsty, but desperate. A woman raised in a court of divorce, deception and dynastic chess, trying to impose order on a kingdom slipping through her fingers. She had grown up watching her mother humiliated, her own legitimacy questioned, her religion dismissed, her future stolen. When she finally got her crown, she clutched it too tightly, and when it began to slip, she set fire to everything she could. But beneath that fire was always fear, that God had abandoned her, that her people hated her, that her legacy would vanish the moment she did. And in some ways, she was right. Because despite all the prayers, all the masses, all the executions, all the proclamations, her Catholic revival was dead the moment she was. Her name, instead of being sung in churches, became a whisper in dark rooms, a reflection in mirrors, a warning. The image of the devout queen gave way to the ghostly figure, not robed in velvet, but in blood. She watches from the shadows now, no longer flesh, no longer feared by courtiers or clergymen, but still there, tucked beneath the stones of Westminster Abbey, sharing eternal rest with the sister who undid her life's work. Queen Mary I of England, first queen regnant, last Catholic monarch with real power. In life she was called devout, dangerous, determined. In death she became something else, entirely a fable, a threat, a flickering silhouette in the corner of a child's bedroom mirror. And yet, even in this diminished form, her story refuses to go quietly. Elizabeth may have taken the throne, but she didn't erase Mary as cleanly as she, or history, might have hoped. No matter how golden the new reign appeared, it was still illuminated by the flame Mary left behind. For every hymn sung in English, there was still the echo of Latin. For every Protestant sermon, there lingered the shadow of a smouldering pyre. And then there was Elizabeth herself. She had learned from Mary, closely, sharply, relentlessly. The two half-sisters had not been raised together in the traditional sense, but their lives twisted and twined around each other like rival vines. Elizabeth, born of Anne Boleyn, and branded a bastard when her mother fell from grace, had spent her early years in uncertain territory. Like Mary, she knew what it meant to be declared illegitimate. Like Mary, she understood the cold diplomacy of royal survival. And like Mary, she knew that being a woman in a man's world meant fighting twice as hard for half the power. But where Mary wielded flame, Elizabeth wielded frost. She watched as Mary's emotional, overt religiosity alienated the people. She noted how public burning sparked public outrage. She saw how Mary's reliance on a foreign husband made her appear weak, even dependent. So Elizabeth did the opposite. She made herself the Virgin Queen, unmarried, unyielding, inscrutable. She kept her faith more political than spiritual. She offered the appearance of moderation. Her religious settlement was carefully balanced, Protestant enough to please reformers, ceremonial enough to soothe the traditionalists. She hung crucifixes in her chapels while refusing to restore papal authority, and above all, she avoided fire. That isn't to say she ruled gently. She didn't. Catholic priests were hunted, conspirators were tortured, plots against her were met with swift public justice, but she killed with silence, not spectacle. Her executions happened behind palace walls or in the name of treason, not heresy. No Latin masses were interrupted with soldiers, no village squares lit up with crackling martyrs. Elizabeth learned that you don't need bonfires to make people obedient, you only need to keep them uncertain. Still, Mary haunted her. Not visibly. Elizabeth rarely spoke of her sister. When she did, it was brief and ceremonial. She acknowledged Mary's place in the lineage, praised her dignity, sometimes her courage. But privately, there are signs that Mary's reign weighed heavily on her. She kept tight control of the narrative. Authorised histories painted Mary's rule as a dangerous detour. The Church of England was no longer just theology. It was national identity. Being Protestant became synonymous with being English. Being Catholic became suspicious, treasonous, foreign. And this division had roots in Mary's fires. The memory of the burnings became foundational, not just in books but in behaviour. Parents warned their children of papists. Ministers referenced the martyrs at pulpit. Street performers reenacted trial scenes for coin. The flames of Mary's reign didn't just burn people, they burned themselves into the culture. And then came the children. Not of Mary, of course. She had none. But children of memory. Children who grew up never having seen a burning, but who felt them anyway. They heard the stories. They read the books. They traced their family trees to a great-uncle or grandmother who had fled the country during Mary's reign, or worse, who had died during it. The trauma was generational. Entire communities carried the legacy, not just of loss, but of transformation. The Marian years, just 5 in total, were compressed into a symbol, a shorthand, a scar. And then came the myths. Over time, Mary's name slid further from fact. Bloody Mary didn't appear in popular parlance until well after her death, but once it surfaced, it spread like the very fire she'd ordered so often. The phrase was simple, evocative, sharp, and history loves simplicity. You can imagine it now, a mother in 1602, her child complaining about the cold. She tells them to hush, to remember the ones who burned. Not long ago, lad, Bloody Mary would have seen you tied to a stake for saying that. Or a preacher, his voice rising in a packed parish hall, pointing to the crucifix and saying, This is what she tried to restore, and people died for it. Or later a teacher scrawling the name Mary I on a chalkboard, underlining it in red. Villain, fanatic, failure. And yet, history has a habit of circling back. By the 18th and 19th centuries, revisionists begin to peek through the smoke. Scholars, especially abroad, argue that Mary was a product of her time, that her execution numbers, while high, weren't exceptional by European standards, that Henry VIII and Elizabeth each killed for religious reasons as well, just less publicly. Catholic historians in particular fight to rehabilitate her image. They point to her intelligence, her resilience, her acts of charity, her efforts to restore education, support hospitals, and stabilise England's coinage. Some go further, arguing that her failure wasn't one of policy, but of timing. That had she reigned longer, had she produced an heir, her legacy might have been one of triumph. But history doesn't reward what-ifs. The fires were real. The screams were heard. The stakes were built and lit and watched by thousands, and Mary, no matter her motives, let them happen. Her legacy, then, is like the soot left behind after a fire. It clings to everything. It refuses to be scrubbed away. And even when it's covered, by legend, by time, by new reigns and new wars, it still lurks beneath, ready to stain again at the slightest touch. Today, she rests quietly, beneath a slab in Westminster. No grand statue, no shrine, no flame, just silence. And yet, her name is still spoken. Not in Massachusetts, not in reverence, but in whispers, in mirrors, 3 times said aloud in darkness. Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary. And in that flickering silence she returns, not as a queen, but as a question. Was she evil? Was she devout? Was she a woman trying to hold together a world that had already decided to burn? The flames have long died out, but in the English imagination they never really go cold. Mary Tudor's name still casts heat, not from the pyres of Smithfield, but from centuries of debate, rumour, and inherited memory. She's etched not only into marble and manuscripts, but into the collective consciousness of a country that can't seem to decide whether to pity her, curse her, or quietly mourn what might have been. By the dawn of the 17th century, her legacy has ossified into something both tragic and terrifying. The burning queen, the devout fanatic, the monarch who would rather light 100 fires than let a single soul wander in her eyes astray. And in that frozen image, it's easy to lose sight of how very human Mary was. She was not born to be hated. She was born a princess, lauded as a miracle child to ageing monarchs. Her early life was one of splendour, courtly pageantry, and a father who, at first, called her his pearl. She was a prodigy, reading Latin and playing music while still in the nursery. She learned theology from some of the most brilliant scholars in Europe. For a time, it seemed she might be England's great uniting queen. But then came Anne Boleyn, and with Anne, the slow erosion of Mary's status. Her parents' marriage was declared invalid. She was deemed illegitimate. Her court was dismantled. She was forced to serve in her baby sister Elizabeth's household, a daily reminder of her fall from grace. Mary went from being England's beloved future to its political inconvenience. That sort of public rejection doesn't just wound, it warps. Mary spent most of her adolescence fighting to preserve her mother's memory and her own dignity. She defied the crown. She refused to acknowledge Anne. She suffered isolation, illness and ridicule. And all the while she clung more tightly to her faith, not just as a spiritual anchor, but as a means of survival. When the world turned its back, the church did not. So it's no surprise that when she finally claimed the crown in 1553, overthrowing the 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey, it felt like divine justice. For the first time in decades, Mary stood in the light. She entered London triumphant, welcomed by cheering crowds and bells ringing from every steeple. She was not just queen, she was deliverance, and in her heart she believed her mission was clear to bring her country back into alignment with God. But belief, no matter how pure, can cloud the vision. Mary didn't see her policy of religious restoration as revenge. She saw it as redemption. Each burning was, in her eyes, a necessary firebreak. Heresy, like plague, needed to be contained. The bodies lost were tragic, but not wasted. If they burned in this world, perhaps their souls might be spared in the next. And there were those who agreed with her. It's easy to forget that in 1553 many Englishmen were still culturally Catholic. The Reformation under Edward VI had been rapid and to some alienating. The return to Latin Mass, the restoration of familiar rituals, the revival of saints' days, these were welcomed by many, at least at first. For some, Mary's reign felt like a return to order, but order enforced by flame cannot hold. The turning point came not with Mary's religion, but with her rigidity. It was the relentlessness of the burnings, the public nature, the rising numbers, the unflinching repetition that turned sympathy into fear, and fear eventually into resentment. In rural towns, families began hiding Bibles in the eaves. Parents warned their children not to speak too freely. Priests held masses with doors bolted. And for every pyre Mary lit, the Protestant identity only grew stronger. And still, she could not see it. She remained surrounded by clergy who supported her cause, by advisers too afraid, or too complicit to challenge her course. Philip, distant and disinterested, offered no real counsel. The Pope, Paul IV, undermined her authority abroad. And Parliament, increasingly reluctant, tiptoed around her policies. Mary was alone, even as she grew physically frail, ravaged by illness, weakened by false pregnancies, bowed by the loss of Calais. She held firm. The fire in her convictions did not dim, even as her body did. It's that steadfastness, that unyielding adherence to what she believed was right, that still bewilders historians today. Some argue she was delusional, that her childless body and her barren marriage drove her to compensate through faith. Others suggest she was politically boxed in, that to pull back from the burnings would have been seen as weakness, especially with Protestant exiles waiting to pounce. But perhaps the truth is simpler. Mary had lost everything once: her title, her family, her place in history. When she regained the crown, she made a vow, silent perhaps, but unshakable, that she would never lose again. Not her faith, not her purpose, not her God. And so she governed not as a ruler, but as a believer. And believers, history tells us, are often the most dangerous rulers of all. Still, even the most devout monarch cannot escape time. As Mary's health failed and her hopes for an heir dissolved, the fires of her reign began to flicker. The burnings slowed, the court quieted, and beneath the surface her subjects began preparing for change. When she died in 1558, there was little mourning. The transition to Elizabeth was swift and seamless. The fires were extinguished overnight. The altars were stripped again. Latin vanished from the pulpit. The Reformation was back, not as rebellion, but as restoration. And Mary Shee became the thing she feared most, a cautionary tale. But cautionary tales are never complete without exaggeration. Over the next century, Mary's image was reshaped again and again. Each retelling pushed her further into caricature. The pious queen became the mad woman. The sorrowful ruler became the blood-drenched villain. The human being became a haunting. She was given a name no monarch had borne before or since Bloody Mary. Not Queen Mary, not Mary Tudor, not Mary I, just Bloody. And that name stuck. Through textbooks, through legends, through the superstitions of children daring each other in candlelit bedrooms. But the real Mary, she remains more difficult to name. She was the first woman to rule England in her own right. She was the first monarch to publicly align governance with a specific religious mission. She was deeply educated, fiercely intelligent, and uncompromising in her morality. She was also fearful, lonely, haunted, and yes, at times, brutal. She was all of these things, and she deserves more than a nickname whispered into mirrors. Because behind the blood and the fire and the smoke stands a woman whose story is not one of madness, but of belief taken too far, of pain left untreated, of power misunderstood. She burned people alive. She believed she was saving their souls. And between those two truths lies a chasm so deep, history still hasn't filled it. The last of Mary's fires turned to ash nearly 5 centuries ago, and yet the embers still glow faintly under the skin of English history. You can trace their heat in the margins of Protestant sermons, in stained glass depictions of Latimer and Ridley, in the shivering, half-believing glances of schoolchildren at a darkened mirror. She ruled for just 5 years. She burned 284 people, but the shadow she left is far longer than her reign ever was, and perhaps no part of her legacy is more debated, more studied, more reshaped than this question. Was it all for faith, or ego? Scholars have wrestled with this dilemma for centuries. The popular story paints Mary as a queen unhinged, bloodthirsty, desperate, locked in a doomed romance with a foreign prince and obsessed with retribution. But this version is tidy, too tidy, because when we dig deeper, we find a far more complex portrait of a woman not driven by madness or malice, but by something far more dangerous certainty. Mary Tudor was not a villain in her own mind. She was a redeemer. She was a queen with a mission so deeply intertwined with her identity that any opposition to her policy wasn't just political, it was personal. Every Protestant preacher she condemned reminded her of the bishops who had exiled her. Every refusal to attend Mass echoed her own banishment. Every heretic she sent to the stake in her mind stood in the same place as those who had tried to erase her from history. And let's not forget, her entire life had taught her that power could be taken away in an instant. She had watched her mother, once Queen of England, reduced to a lonely widow, her title stripped and her letters ignored. She had been declared illegitimate, treated like a political inconvenience, and forced to serve in her half-sister's household. Her faith was mocked, her rank dismantled. So when the crown finally came to her, when the people cheered her name and rang the bells in celebration, she wrapped her hands around power like someone gripping a lifeline. It wasn't ego, it was survival. She believed that without decisive godly action, everything could be undone. That's why she burned, because she truly believed that leniency would mean damnation, not just for her, but for her country. She wasn't seeking revenge, she was seeking redemption. Of course, it's hard to square redemption with firewood, because whatever her intentions, the outcome was horrifying. People died, horribly, publicly, and their deaths were not forgotten. Fox's Book of Martyrs ensured that. It didn't just catalogue the executions, it framed them. It gave the victims voices, dignity, and a form of sainthood. It turned Mary's enemies into England's heroes, and Mary herself into England's monster. But not everyone agreed with this portrayal. Catholic writers, especially outside England, saw her differently. They called her Maria la Cattolica, a queen who stood against the Protestant tide with grace and courage. They emphasised her restoration of the Latin Mass, her charity, her resistance to political pressure. In some Spanish and Italian circles, she was spoken of with genuine reverence, even admiration. But those voices didn't shape the narrative. The English Protestant machine did, and it had every reason to do so. Elizabeth's regime needed a contrast, something to define itself against. Mary, with her fires and foreign marriage and lack of heirs, made the perfect foil. She was painted as backward, excessive, foreign. Elizabeth became, by comparison, modern, temperate, and distinctly English. Mary's reign was condensed into a cautionary tale, and that caution grew with every retelling. By the time the 18th century dawned, Mary's legacy had hardened into horror. Her name evoked not policy but punishment. She was stripped of nuance, wrapped in smoke, and made into a boggy woman. Bloody Mary! And yet, even in her darkest hour, there were moments that don't fit the caricature. She showed deep loyalty to her friends. She forgave many of her enemies. She resisted calls to execute Elizabeth early in her reign, even though she had every reason, and every legal pretext to do so. Her support for hospitals, her restoration of coinage, her efforts to ease the burden of the poor, these rarely make it into the mirror chant, because they don't burn. And our memory of Mary has always been about the fire. But fire, as any historian will tell you, does more than destroy. It illuminates, it clarifies, it reveals what's beneath the surface. Mary's fire revealed a country in conflict with itself, a people torn between old rituals and new doctrines, a court unsure whether the future lay in Rome or reform. Her reign wasn't a pause in progress, it was a boiling point, a national confrontation with its spiritual identity, and like many confrontations, it ended in ashes. But there's something else fire leaves behind embers, quiet, persistent, capable of reigniting at any moment, and Mary's legacy, though often reduced to a whisper in a mirror, is one of those embers. Because for every child who dared to summon her ghost, for every preacher who invoked her name in warning, for every historian who returned to the records to ask what really happened, Mary endures, not as a saint, not as a monster, but as a woman who made choices few understood and fewer forgave, who governed not with cruelty but with conviction, who prayed as she ruled, and ruled until she could no longer pray. Even her final moments reflect this duality. As she lay dying, surrounded by incense and Latin prayers, her body failing and her hopes for an ere long buried, she reportedly whispered regrets, not of policy, but of trust, that she had relied too much on Philip, that she had loved too deeply, hoped too much, that she had burned for others and found no warmth left for herself. These words, if they were ever truly spoken, don't appear in official records. But they linger in the oral tradition, passed down through letters, journals, and cautious speculation. They paint a picture of a woman not immune to reflection, but trapped by it. She wanted to save England. She believed she could. She tried, and then she died, leaving behind a kingdom that would remember her not with candles or masses, but with mirrors and myths. And so we ask again, was it all for faith or ego? And the answer, frustratingly, may be both. Because Mary Tudor was not a cartoon, she was not a chant, she was not a horror story whispered by candlelight. She was a queen, and like all queens, she ruled the best way she knew how, even when it meant lighting a match. So now we stand at the final page of Mary Tudor's story, a reign reduced by centuries into a name, a whisper, an epithet so etched into the cultural psyche that it has lost all its edges. Bloody Mary, a title said in jest, in games, in sleepovers and slumber party dares. Few who murmur it know the real woman behind the myth. Fewer still wonder who she was before the flames. But in this closing hour, let's draw the curtain back just one more time, not to justify her, nor to forgive her, but to understand what she truly left behind. Because fire may consume, but it also reveals. It reveals what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. What endures about Mary is not merely the tally of the dead, though history is meticulous in keeping the number 284 Protestants, men and women, old and young, burned not in secret, but in markets, churchyards and squares, watched by neighbours, grieved by families, immortalised by pen and pulpit. That number, heavy as stone, has shaped every conversation since. It became a wall against nuance, an anchor to moral judgment, but buried beneath it, tangled in the ash, is something else, a queen who desperately, perhaps foolishly, tried to turn back the clock. Because make no mistake, Mary's reign was a reversal, not just religiously, but emotionally. She attempted to rewind the nation to a time before her father's break with Rome, before the crown superseded the cross, before Henry VIII fractured the soul of his own kingdom to pursue a male heir. Mary tried to undo that rupture, not with gentle persuasion, but with steel and stake. But England had already changed. By 1553, the English Reformation wasn't just a theological movement, it was an identity. The Bible in English, the simplicity of Reformed worship, the weakening of clerical power, these things had taken root. They weren't just imposed, they were embraced by a generation that had never known anything else. And when Mary tried to erase them, she wasn't seen as a healer, she was seen as an invader, a monarch from the past clawing into the present. Even her marriage to Philip of Spain played into that perception. It wasn't simply a political alliance, it was confirmation, in the eyes of many, that England was being sold to a foreign power. Philip was Catholic, yes, but more importantly he was foreign and aloof and often absent. When he did visit England, he was cold and formal. When he left, he barely wrote. Mary's love for him, deep, sincere, unrequited, became yet another wound that would not heal. And so, her reign spiralled, not in chaos but in suffocation. The burnings, the court rituals, the phantom pregnancies, these were symptoms of a queen caught between a personal past she could never escape and a national future she could never control. Each day she clung more tightly to her convictions. Each day the people turned a little further away, and when she died there were no riots, no candles in the windows, no masses for her soul, just a country exhaling quietly, carefully. Elizabeth stepped into the silence not as a ruler, but as a reckoning. She offered not just a new monarch, but a new myth, a queen who promised moderation, peace, and above all, identity. She did not erase Mary, she absorbed her. Elizabeth's church preserved some Catholic forms while asserting Protestant substance. Her rule was filled with cautionary glances backward, and every one of those glances landed on Mary's shadow. Because Mary's England was not just a memory, it was a warning. And what does that warning say 5 centuries later? Perhaps it says this belief without mercy becomes a blade, that good intentions, when married to absolute power, can become indistinguishable from cruelty, that a queen's love for her people must extend beyond their souls to their bodies, to their right to dissent, to the way they kneel or choose not to. Perhaps it says that faith alone is not enough. But it also says this Mary Tudor was no monster. She was a woman of staggering resilience, raised in one of the most volatile courts in history. She endured betrayal, banishment and heartbreak before she ever wore a crown. And when she finally did, she ruled not as a pawn, but as a force. She did not flinch. She did not bend. She believed with every breath that she was doing what was right, not for herself, but for England. And history, cruel and unrelenting, made her pay for that belief. It is easy to hate a caricature. It is harder to look into the eyes of a woman and see not blood, but fear, not tyranny, but purpose, not madness, but grief. Mary had no statues raised in her honour, no poems written in her name, no dynasties descended from her womb. She was, in every sense, the end of her line, and yet she endures. In mirrors, in legends, in the haunting question that every ruler must face, what will I leave behind, Mary left fire. But she also left a mirror for us to look into, if we dare. A mirror that reflects what happens when conviction outweighs compassion, when power becomes a pulpit, when queens are denied their softness and turn instead to steel. That mirror doesn't lie, and when you whisper her name 3 times, perhaps you're not summoning a ghost at all, perhaps you're summoning a reckoning. So now, with the fires long gone and the last echoes of Latin prayers fading into silence, let's step gently back from the past. You've walked through smoke tonight, through cathedrals and courtrooms, through tears and ash, through the inner sanctum of a queen whose story was never allowed to rest. You've heard the voices of martyrs, of monarchs, of memories that flicker and fade like candlelight. But now the hour grows late. Let your breath settle, let your mind slow. The weight of history can be heavy, but it also hums with calm when the noise slips away. The streets of Tudor London are quiet now. The firewood is damp, untouched. The voices that once screamed or sang beneath the flame are silent, wrapped in the dark stillness of memory. You are safe here, far beyond their reach, watching only with the gentlest of curiosity. Let your eyes drift to that mirror again, not the one children use for games, but the mirror of time. See yourself reflected in its surface, flawed, questioning, always learning, just like them, just like her. Mary is gone, but understanding lingers, and in that quiet understanding perhaps we are all a little less afraid of the dark. Sleep now, dear listener. Let the past fold itself neatly behind your dreams. Tomorrow will come, and with it, new stories. But tonight belongs to her.